Welcome, dear listeners, to a world full of secrets, where nothing is as it seems, and behind every shadow lies a story that will chill you to the bone. Tonight, we take you on a new journey deep into mystery and suspense, in part 2 of the thrilling story, The Shadow of Fu-Manchu. A new confrontation, hidden truths revealed, and danger creeping ever closer. If you're a fan of crime fiction, psychological suspense, and breath-stealing mystery, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Now let the story begin. One of the doctor's watchdogs may be in the foyer, he said thoughtfully, and it might spoil everything if we were seen to go to Guthrie's rooms. There must be a back entrance to the kitchens and so on? There is, I replied quickly. I have seen the vans delivering there, but have we time? Yes, lead on. We walked up the Strand and hurried westward, into that narrow court, with its iron posts and descending steps, upon which opens a well-known wine cellar. We turned. Then, going parallel with the Strand, but on the embankment level, we ran round the back of the great hotel and came to double doors which were open. An arc lamp illuminated the interior, and a number of men were at work among the casks, crates, and packages stacked about the place. We entered. "Hello!" cried a man in a white overall. "Where do you think you're going?" Smith grasped him by the arm. "I want to get to the public part of the hotel without being seen from the entrance hall," he said. "Will you please lead the way?" "Here," began the other, staring. "Don't waste time," snapped my friend, in that tone of authority which he knew so well how to assume. "It's a matter of life and death. Lead the way, I say." "Police, sir?" asked the man civilly. "Yes," said Smith. "Hurry!" Off went our guide without further demur. Skirting sculleries, kitchens, laundries, and engine rooms, he led us through those mysterious labyrinths which have no existence for the guest above, but which contain the machinery that renders these modern khans the Aladdin's palaces they are. On a second-floor landing, we met a man in a tweed suit, to whom our cicerone presented us. "Glad I met you, sir. 2 gentlemen from the police." The man regarded us haughtily with a suspicious smile. "Who are you?" he asked. "You're not from Scotland Yard, at any rate." Smith pulled out a card and thrust it into the speaker's hand. "If you are the hotel detective," he said, "take us without delay to Mr. Graham Guthrie." A marked change took place in the other's demeanor on glancing at the card in his hand. "Excuse me, sir," he said deferentially, "but of course I didn't know who I was speaking to. We all have instructions to give you every assistance." "Is Mr. Guthrie in his room?" "He's been in his room for some time, sir. You will want to get there without being seen. This way. We can join the lift on the 3rd floor." Off we went again with our new guide. In the lift. "Have you noticed anything suspicious about the place tonight?" asked Smith. "I have," was the startling reply. "That accounts for your finding me where you did. My usual post is in the lobby. But about 11 o'clock, when the theater people began to come in, I had a hazy sort of impression that someone or something slipped past in the crowd, something that had no business in the hotel." We got out of the lift. "I don't quite follow you," said Smith. "If you thought you saw something entering, you must have formed a more or less definite impression regarding it." "That's the funny part of the business," answered the man doggedly. "I didn't, but as I stood at the top of the stairs, I could have sworn that there was something crawling up behind a party. 2 ladies and 2 gentlemen. A dog, for instance?" "It didn't strike me as being a dog, sir. Anyway, when the party passed me, there was nothing there. Mind you, whatever it was, it hadn't come in by the front. I have made inquiries everywhere, but without result." He stopped abruptly. "No, 189, Mr. Guthrie's door, sir." Smith knocked. "Hello?" came a muffled voice. "What do you want?" "Open the door. Don't delay. It is important." He turned to the hotel detective. "Stay right there where you can watch the stairs and the lift," he instructed. "And note everyone and everything that passes this door. But whatever you see or hear, do nothing without my orders." The man moved off and the door was opened. Smith whispered in my ear, "Some creature of Dr. Fu-Manchu is in the hotel." Mr. Graham Guthrie, British resident in North Bhutan, was a big, thick-set man, gray-haired and florid with widely opened eyes of the true fighting blue, a bristling mustache and prominent shaggy brows. Nayland Smith introduced himself tersely, proffering his card and an open letter. "Those are my credentials, Mr. Guthrie," he said. So no doubt you will realize that the business which brings me and my friend Dr. Petrie here at such an hour is of the first importance." He switched off the light. "There is no time for ceremony," he explained. "It is now 25 minutes past 12. At 1:30 an attempt will be made upon your life." "Mr. Smith," said the other, who, arrayed in his pajamas, was seated on the edge of the bed, "you alarm me very greatly. I may mention that I was advised of your presence in England this morning. Do you know anything respecting the person called Fu-Manchu, Dr. Fu-Manchu?" "Only what I was told today, that he is the agent of an advanced political group. It is opposed to his interest that you should return to Bhutan. A more gullible agent would be preferable. Therefore, unless you implicitly obey my instructions, you will never leave England." Graham Guthrie breathed quickly. I was growing more used to the gloom, and I could dimly discern him, his face turned towards Nayland Smith, whilst with his hand he clutched the bed rail. Such a visit as ours, I think, must have shaken the nerve of any man. "But, Mr. Smith," he said, "surely I am safe enough here. The place is full of American visitors at present, and I have had to be content with a room right at the top, so that the only danger I apprehend is that of fire." "There is another danger," replied Smith. "The fact that you are at the top of the building enhances that danger. Do you recall anything of the mysterious epidemic which broke out in Rangoon in 1908? The deaths due to the call of Siva?" "I read of it in the Indian papers," said Guthrie uneasily. "Suicides, were they not?" "No," snapped Smith. "Murders!" There was a brief silence. "From what I recall of the cases," said Guthrie, "that seems impossible. In several instances, the victims threw themselves from the windows of locked rooms, and the windows were quite inaccessible." "Exactly," replied Smith, and in the dim light his revolver gleamed dully as he placed it on the small table beside the bed. "Except that your door is unlocked, the conditions tonight are identical. Silence, please, I hear a clock striking." It was Big Ben. It struck the half-hour, leaving the stillness complete. In that room, high above the activity which yet prevailed below, high above the supping crowds in the hotel, high above the starving crowds on the embankment, a curious chill of isolation swept about me. Again I realized how in the very heart of the great metropolis, a man may be as far from aid as in the heart of a desert. I was glad that I was not alone in that room, marked with the death mark of Fu-Manchu, and I am certain that Graham Guthrie welcomed his unexpected company. I may have mentioned the fact before, but on this occasion it became so peculiarly evident to me that I am constrained to record it here. I refer to the sense of impending danger which invariably preceded a visit from Fu-Manchu. Even had I not known that an attempt was to be made that night, I should have realized it, as, strung to high tension, I waited in the darkness. Some invisible herald went ahead of the dreadful Chinaman, proclaiming his coming to every nerve in one's body. It was like a breath of astral incense announcing the presence of the priests of death. A wail, low but singularly penetrating, falling in minor cadences to a new silence, came from somewhere close at hand. "My God!" hissed Guthrie. "What was that?" "The call of Siva," whispered Smith. "Don't stir for your life!" Guthrie was breathing hard. I knew that we were three, that the hotel detective was within hail, that there was a telephone in the room, that the traffic of the embankment moved almost beneath us. But I knew, and am not ashamed to confess, that King Fear had icy fingers about my heart. It was awful, that tense waiting for what? 3 taps sounded, very distinctly upon the window. Graham Guthrie started so as to shake the bed. "It's supernatural," he muttered, all that was Celtic in his blood recoiling from the omen. "Nothing human can reach that window." "Shh!" from Smith. "Don't stir." The tapping was repeated. Smith softly crossed the room. My heart was beating painfully. He threw open the window. Further inaction was impossible. I joined him, and we looked out into the empty air. "Don't come too near, Petrie," he warned over his shoulder. One on either side of the open window, we stood and looked down at the moving embankment lights, at the glitter of the Thames, at the silhouetted buildings on the farther bank, with the shot tower starting above them all. 3 taps sounded on the panes above us. In all my dealings with Dr. Fu-Manchu, I had had to face nothing so uncanny as this. What Burmese ghoul had he loosed? Was it outside, in the air? Was it actually in the room? "Don't let me go, Petrie," whispered Smith suddenly. "Get a tight hold on me." That was the last straw, for I thought that some dreadful fascination was impelling my friend to hurl himself out. Wildly, I threw my arms about him, and Guthrie leaped forward to help. Smith leaned from the window and looked up. One choking cry he gave, smothered, inarticulate, and I found him slipping from my grip, being drawn out of the window, drawn to his death. "Hold him, Guthrie!" I gasped hoarsely. "My God, he's going! Hold him!" My friend writhed in our grasp, and I saw him stretch his arm upward. The crack of his revolver came, and he collapsed onto the floor, carrying me with him. But as I fell, I heard a scream above. Smith's revolver went hurtling through the air, and hard upon it went a black shape, flashing past the open window into the gulf of the night. "The light! The light!" I cried. Guthrie ran and turned on the light. Nayland Smith, his eyes starting from his head, his face swollen, lay plucking at a silken cord which showed tight about his throat. "It was a thug!" screamed Guthrie. "Get the rope off! He's choking!" My hands a twitch, I seized the strangling cord. "A knife, quick!" I cried. "I have lost mine!" Guthrie ran to the dressing table and passed me an open penknife. I somehow forced the blade between the rope and Smith's swollen neck and severed the deadly silken thing. Smith made a choking noise and fell back, swooning in my arms. When later we stood looking down upon the mutilated thing which had been brought in from where it fell, Smith showed me a mark on the brow, close beside the wound where his bullet had entered. "The mark of Kali," he said. The man was a fancier, a religious strangler. Since Fu-Manchu has dacoits in his service, I might have expected that he would have thugs. A group of these fiends would seem to have fled into Burma, so that the mysterious epidemic in Rangoon was really an outbreak of thuggee on slightly improved lines. I had suspected something of the kind, but naturally, I had not looked for thugs near Rangoon. My unexpected resistance led the strangler to bungle the rope. "You have seen how it was fastened about my throat?" That was unscientific. The true method, as practiced by the group operating in Burma, was to throw the line about the victim's neck and jerk him from the window. A man leaning from an open window is very nicely poised. It requires only a slight jerk to pitch him forward. No loop was used, but a running line, which, as the victim fell, remained in the hand of the murderer. No clue. Therefore, we see at once what commended the system to Fu-Manchu. Graham Guthrie, very pale, stood looking down at the dead strangler. "I owe you my life, Mr. Smith," he said. "If you had come 5 minutes later—" He grasped Smith's hand. "You see," Guthrie continued, "no one thought of looking for a thug in Burma, and no one thought of the roof. These fellows are as active as monkeys, and where an ordinary man would infallibly break his neck, they are entirely at home. I might have chosen my room especially for the business." "He slipped in late this evening," said Smith. "The hotel detective saw him, but these stranglers are as elusive as shadows. Otherwise, despite their having changed the scene of their operations, not one could have survived." "Didn't you mention a case of this kind on the Irrawaddy?" I asked. "Yes," was the reply. "And I know of what you are thinking. The steamers of the Irrawaddy flotilla have a corrugated iron roof over the top deck. The thug must have been lying up there as the Kalassi passed on the deck below." "But Smith, what is the motive of the call?" I continued. "Partly religious," he explained, "and partly to wake the victims. You are perhaps going to ask me how Dr. Fu-Manchu has obtained power over such people as fancigars? I can only reply that Dr. Fu-Manchu has secret knowledge of which, so far, we know absolutely nothing. But despite all, at last I begin to score." "You do," I agreed. "But your victory took you near to death." "I owe my life to you, Petrie," he said. "Once to your strength of arm and once to—" "Don't speak of her, Smith," I interrupted. "Dr. Fu-Manchu may have discovered the part she played, in which event, God help her." Upon the following day we were afoot again, and shortly at hand grips with the enemy. In retrospect, that restless time offers a chaotic prospect, with no peaceful spot amid its turmoils. All that was reposeful in nature seemed to have become an irony and a mockery to us. Who knew how an evil demigod had his sacrificial altars amid our sweetest groves? This idea ruled strongly in my mind upon that soft autumnal day. "The net is closing in," said Nayland Smith. "Let us hope upon a big catch," I replied with a laugh. Beyond where the Thames tided slumberously seaward showed the roofs of Royal Windsor, the castle towers showing through the autumn haze. The piece of beautiful Thameside was about us. This was one of the few tangible clues upon which thus far we had chanced. But at last it seemed indeed that we were narrowing the resources of that enemy of the white race who was writing his name over England in characters of blood. To capture Dr. Fu-Manchu we did not hope, but at least there was every promise of destroying one of the enemy's strongholds. We had circled upon the map a tract of country cut by the Thames with Windsor for its center. Within that circle was the house from which miraculously we had escaped, a house used by the most highly organized group in the history of criminology. So much we knew. Even if we found the house, and this was likely enough, to find it vacated by Fu-Manchu and his mysterious servants, we were prepared, but it would be a base destroyed. We were working upon a methodical plan, and although our cooperators were invisible, these numbered no fewer than 12, all of them experienced men. Thus far we had drawn blank, but the place for which Smith and I were making now came clearly into view. An old mansion situated in extensive walled grounds. Leaving the river behind us, we turned sharply to the right along a lane flanked by a high wall. On an open patch of ground as we passed, I noted a gypsy caravan. An old woman was seated on the steps, her wrinkled face bent, her chin resting in the palm of her hand. I scarcely glanced at her, but pressed on, nor did I notice that my friend no longer was beside me. I was all anxiety to come to some point from whence I might obtain a view of the house. All anxiety to know if this was the abode of our mysterious enemy, the place where he worked amid his weird company, where he bred his deadly scorpions and his bacilli, reared his poisonous fungi, from whence he dispatched his murder ministers. Above all, perhaps, I wondered if this would prove to be the hiding place of the beautiful slave girl who was such a potent factor in the doctor's plans. But a two-edged sword, which yet we hoped to turn upon Fu-Manchu. Even in the hands of a master, a woman's beauty is a dangerous weapon. A cry rang out behind me. I turned quickly, and a singular sight met my gaze. Nayland Smith was engaged in a furious struggle with the old gypsy woman. His long arms clasped about her, he was roughly dragging her out into the roadway, she fighting like a wild thing, silently, fiercely. Smith often surprised me, but at that sight, frankly, I thought that he was become bereft of reason. I ran back, and I had almost reached the scene of this incredible contest, and Smith now was evidently hard put to it to hold his own, when a man, swarthy, with big rings in his ears, leaped from the caravan. One quick glance he threw in our direction, and made off towards the river. Smith twisted round upon me, never releasing his hold of the woman. "After him, Petrie!" he cried. "After him! Don't let him escape! It's a dacoit!" My brain in a confused whirl, my mind yet disposed to a belief that my friend had lost his senses. The word dacoit was sufficient. I started down the road after the fleetly running man. Never once did he glance behind him, so that he evidently had occasion to fear pursuit. The dusty road rang beneath my flying footsteps. That sense of fantasy, which claimed me often enough in those days of our struggle with the titanic genius whose victory meant the victory of the yellow races over the white, now had me fast in its grip again. I was an actor in one of those dream scenes of the grim Fu-Manchu drama. Out over the grass and down to the river's brink ran the gypsy who was no gypsy, but one of that far more sinister brotherhood, the dacoits. I was close upon his heels, but I was not prepared for him to leap in among the rushes at the margin of the stream. And seeing him do this, I pulled up quickly. Straight into the water he plunged, and I saw that he held some object in his hand. He waded out, he dived, and as I gained the bank and looked to right and left, he had vanished completely. Only ever-widening rings showed where he had been. I had him. For directly he rose to the surface, he would be visible from either bank, and with the police whistle which I carried, I could, if necessary, summon one of the men in hiding across the stream. I waited. A wildfowl floated serenely past, untroubled by this strange invasion of his precincts. A full minute I waited. From the lane behind me came Smith's voice. "Don't let him escape, Petrie!" Never lifting my eyes from the water, I waved my hand reassuringly, but still the dacoit did not rise. I searched the surface in all directions as far as my eyes could reach, but no swimmer showed above it. Then it was that I concluded he had dived too deeply, become entangled in the weeds, and was drowned. With a final glance to right and left and some feeling of awe at this sudden tragedy, this grim going out of a life at glorious noonday, I turned away. Smith had the woman securely, but I had not taken 5 steps towards him when a faint splash behind warned me. Instinctively, I ducked. From whence that saving instinct arose I cannot surmise, but to it I owed my life. For as I rapidly lowered my head, something hummed past me, something that flew out over the grass bank and fell with a jangle upon the dusty roadside.
A knife!
I turned and bounded back to the river's brink. I heard a faint cry behind me, which could only have come from the gypsy woman. Nothing disturbed the calm surface of the water. The reach was lonely of rowers. Out by the farther bank, a girl was poling a punt along, and her white-clad figure was the only living thing that moved upon the river within the range of the most expert knife-thrower. To say that I was nonplussed is to say less than the truth. I was amazed. That it was the dacoit who had shown me this murderous attention I could not doubt. But where in heaven's name was he? He could not humanly have remained below water for so long. Yet he certainly was not above, was not upon the surface, concealed amongst the reeds, nor hidden upon the bank. There, in the bright sunshine, a consciousness of the eerie possessed me. It was with an uncomfortable feeling that my phantom foe might be aiming a second knife at my back that I turned away and hastened towards Smith. My fearful expectations were not realized, and I picked up the little weapon which had so narrowly missed me, and with it in my hand rejoined my friend. He was standing with one arm closely clasped about the apparently exhausted woman, and her dark eyes were fixed upon him with an extraordinary expression. "What does it mean, Smith?" I began, but he interrupted me. "Where's the dacoit?" he demanded rapidly. "Since he seemingly possesses the attributes of a fish," I replied, "I cannot pretend to say." The gypsy woman lifted her eyes to mine and laughed. Her laughter was musical, not that of such an old hag as Smith held captive. It was familiar, too. I started and looked closely into the wizened face. "He's tricked you," said Smith, an angry note in his voice. "What is that you have in your hand?" I showed him the knife and told him how it had come into my possession. "I know," he rapped. "I saw it. He was in the water not 3 yards from where you stood. You must have seen him. Was there nothing visible?" "Nothing." The woman laughed again, and again I wondered. "A wild fowl," I added, "nothing else." "A wild fowl," snapped Smith. "If you will consult your recollections of the habits of wildfowl, you will see that this particular specimen was a rara avis. It's an old trick, Petrie, but a good one, for it is used in decoying. A dacoit's head was concealed in that wildfowl. It's useless. He has certainly made good his escape by now." "Smith," I said, somewhat crestfallen, "why are you detaining this gypsy woman?" "Gypsy woman," he laughed, hugging her tightly as she made an impatient movement. "Use your eyes, old man." He jerked the frowsy wig from her head, and beneath was a cloud of disordered hair that shimmered in the sunlight. "A wet sponge will do the rest," he said. Into my eyes, widely opened in wonder, looked the dark eyes of the captive, and beneath the disguise I picked out the charming features of the slave girl. There were tears on the whitened lashes, and she was submissive now. "This time," said my friend hardly, "we have fairly captured her, and we will hold her." From somewhere upstream came a faint call. "The dacoit!" Nayland Smith's lean body straightened. He stood alert, strung up. Another call answered, and a third responded. Then followed the flatly shrill note of a police whistle, and I noted a column of black vapor rising beyond the wall, mounting straight to heaven as the smoke of a welcome offering. "The surrounded mansion was in flames!" "Curse it!" rapped Smith. So this time we were right. But of course he has had ample opportunity to remove his effects. I knew that. The man's daring is incredible. He has given himself till the very last moment, and we blundered upon 2 of the outposts. I lost one. No matter. We have the other. I expect no further arrests, and the house will have been so well fired by the doctor's servants that nothing can save it. I fear its ashes will afford us no clue, Petrie, but we have secured a lever which should serve to disturb Fu-Manchu's world. He glanced at the queer figure which hung submissively in his arms. She looked up proudly. "You need not hold me so tight," she said in her soft voice. "I will come with you." That I moved amid singular happenings, you who have borne with me thus far have learned, and that I witnessed many curious scenes, but of the many such scenes in that race drama wherein Nayland Smith and Dr. Fu-Manchu played the leading parts, I remember none more bizarre than the one at my rooms that afternoon. Without delay, and without taking the Scotland Yard men into our confidence, we had hurried our prisoner back to London, for my friend's authority was supreme. A strange trio we were, and one which excited no little comment, but the journey came to an end at last. Now we were in my unpretentious sitting room, the room wherein Smith first had unfolded to me the story of Dr. Fu-Manchu and of the great secret society which sought to upset the balance of the world, to place Europe and America beneath the scepter of Cathay. I sat with my elbows upon the writing table, my chin in my hands. Smith restlessly paced the floor, relighting his blackened briar a dozen times in as many minutes. In the big armchair, the pseudo-gypsy was curled up. A brief toilet had converted the wizened old woman's face into that of a fascinatingly pretty girl. Wildly picturesque, she looked in her ragged Romany garb. She held a cigarette in her fingers and watched us through lowered lashes. Seemingly, with true Oriental fatalism, she was quite reconciled to her fate, and ever and anon she would bestow upon me a glance from her beautiful eyes, which few men, I say with confidence, could have sustained unmoved. Though I could not be blind to the emotions of that passionate Eastern soul, yet I strove not to think of them. Accomplice of an arch-murderer she might be, but she was dangerously lovely. "That man who was with you," said Smith, suddenly turning upon her, "was in Burma up till quite recently. He murdered a fisherman 30 miles above Prome only a month before I left. The DSP had placed 1,000 rupees on his head, am I right?" The girl shrugged her shoulders. What then?" she asked. "Suppose I handed you over to the police," suggested Smith. But he spoke without conviction, for in the recent past we both had owed our lives to this girl. "As you please," she replied. "The police would learn nothing." "You do not belong to the Far East," my friend said abruptly. "You may have Eastern blood in your veins, but you are no kin of Fu-Manchu." "That is true," she admitted, and knocked the ash from her cigarette. "Will you tell me where to find Fu-Manchu?" She shrugged her shoulders again, glancing eloquently in my direction. Smith walked to the door. "I must make out my report, Petrie," he said. "Look after the prisoner." And as the door closed softly behind him, I knew what was expected of me. But honestly, I shirked my responsibility. What attitude should I adopt? How should I go about my delicate task? In a quandary, I stood watching the girl whom singular circumstances saw captive in my rooms. "You do not think we would harm you?" I began awkwardly. "No harm shall come to you. Why will you not trust us?" She raised her brilliant eyes. "Of what avail has your protection been to some of those others," she said, "those others whom he has sought for?" Alas, it had been of none, and I knew it well. I thought I grasped the drift of her words. "You mean that if you speak, Fu-Manchu will find a way of killing you?" "Of killing me!" she flashed scornfully. "Do I seem one to fear for myself?" "Then what do you fear?" I asked in surprise. She looked at me oddly. "When I was seized and sold for a slave," she answered slowly, "my sister was taken too, and my brother, a child." She spoke the word with a tender intonation, and her slight accent rendered it the more soft. "My sister died in the desert, my brother lived. Better, far better that he had died too." Her words impressed me intensely. "Of what are you speaking?" I questioned. "You speak of slave raids, of the desert. Where did these things take place? Of what country are you?" "Does it matter?" she questioned in turn. "Of what country am I? A slave has no country, no name." "No name!" I cried. "You may call me Karamaneh," she said. "As Karamaneh, I was sold to Dr. Fu-Manchu, and my brother also he purchased. We were cheap at the price he paid." She laughed shortly, wildly. "But he has spent a lot of money to educate me. My brother is all that is left to me in the world to love, and he is in the power of Dr. Fu-Manchu. You understand? It is upon him the blow will fall. You ask me to fight against Fu-Manchu. You talk of protection. Did your protection save Sir Crichton Davey?" I shook my head sadly. "You understand now why I cannot disobey my master's orders, why if I would, I dare not betray him." I walked to the window and looked out. How could I answer her arguments? What could I say? I heard the rustle of her ragged skirts, and she who called herself Karamaneh stood beside me. She laid her hand upon my arm. "Let me go," she pleaded. "He will kill him! He will kill him!" Her voice shook with emotion. "He cannot revenge himself upon your brother when you are in no way to blame," I said angrily. "We arrested you. You are not here of your own free will." She drew her breath sharply, clutching at my arm, and in her eyes I could read that she was forcing her mind to some arduous decision. "Listen." She was speaking rapidly, nervously. "If I help you to take Dr. Fu-Manchu, tell you where he is to be found alone, will you promise me, solemnly promise me, that you will immediately go to the place where I shall guide you and release my brother, that you will let us both go free?" "I will," I said without hesitation. You may rest assured of it. But there is a condition, she added. What is it? When I have told you where to capture him, you must release me. I hesitated. Smith often had accused me of weakness where this girl was concerned. What now was my plain duty? That she would utterly decline to speak under any circumstances unless it suited her to do so, I felt assured. If she spoke the truth in her proposed bargain, there was no personal element. Her conduct I now viewed in a new light. Humanity, I thought, dictated that I accept her proposal. Policy also. I agree, I said, and looked into her eyes, which were aflame now with emotion, an excitement perhaps of anticipation, perhaps of fear. She laid her hands upon my shoulders. You will be careful? She said pleadingly. For your sake, I replied. I shall. Not for my sake. Then for your brother's. No. Her voice had sunk to a whisper. For your own. A cool breeze met us, blowing from the lower reaches of the Thames. Far behind us twinkled the dim lights of Lowe's cottages, the last regular habitations abutting upon the marshes. Between us and the cottages stretched half a mile of lush land through which at this season there were, however, numerous dry paths. Before us the flats again, a dull, monotonous expanse beneath the moon, with the promise of the cool breeze that the river flowed round the bend ahead. It was very quiet. Only the sound of our footsteps, as Nayland Smith and I tramped steadily towards our goal, broke the stillness of that lonely place. Not once, but many times within the last 20 minutes, I had thought that we were ill-advised to adventure alone upon the capture of the formidable Chinese doctor. But we were following out our compact with Karamaneh, and one of her stipulations had been that the police must not be acquainted with her share in the matter. A light came into view far ahead of us. That's the light, Petrie, said Smith. If we keep that straight before us, according to our information, we shall strike the hulk. I grasped the revolver in my pocket, and the presence of the little weapon was curiously reassuring. I have endeavored, perhaps in extenuation of my own fears, to explain how about Dr. Fu-Manchu there rested an atmosphere of horror, peculiar, unique. He was not as other men. The dread that he inspired in all with whom he came in contact, the terrors which he controlled and hurled at whomsoever cumbered his path, rendered him an object supremely sinister. I despair of conveying to those who may read this account any but the coldest conception of the man's evil power. Smith stopped suddenly and grasped my arm. We stood listening. What? I asked. You heard nothing? I shook my head. Smith was peering back over the marshes in his oddly alert way. He turned to me, and his tanned face wore a peculiar expression. You don't think it's a trap? He jerked. We are trusting her blindly. Strange it may seem, but something within me rose in arms against the innuendo. I don't, I said shortly. He nodded. We pressed on. 10 minutes steady tramping brought us within sight of the Thames. Smith and I both had noticed how Fu-Manchu's activities centered always about the London River. Undoubtedly it was his highway, his line of communication, along which he moved his mysterious forces. The opium den off Shadwell Highway, the mansion upstream, at that hour a smoldering shell. Now the hulk lying off the marshes. Always he made his headquarters upon the river. It was significant, and even if tonight's expedition should fail, this was a clue for our future guidance. Bear to the right, directed Smith. We must reconnoiter before making our attack. We took a path that led directly to the riverbank. Before us lay the gray expanse of water, and out upon it moved the busy shipping of the great mercantile city. But this life of the river seemed widely removed from us. The lonely spot where we stood had no kinship with human activity. Its dreariness illuminated by the brilliant moon, it looked indeed a fit setting for an act in such a drama as that wherein we played our parts. When I had lain in the East End opium den, when upon such another night as this I had looked out upon a peaceful Norfolk countryside, the same knowledge of aloofness, of utter detachment from the world of living men, had come to me. Silently, Smith stared out at the distant moving lights. Karamaneh merely means a slave, he said irrelevantly. I made no comment. There's the hulk, he added. The bank upon which we stood dipped in mud slopes to the level of the running tide. Seaward it rose higher, and by a narrow inlet, for we perceived that we were upon a kind of promontory, a rough pier showed. Beneath it was a shadowy shape in the patch of gloom which the moon threw far out upon the softly eddying water. Only one dim light was visible amid this darkness. That will be the cabin, said Smith. Acting upon our prearranged plan, we turned and walked up onto the staging above the hulk. A wooden ladder led out and down to the deck below, and was loosely lashed to a ring on the pier. With every motion of the tidal waters, the ladder rose and fell, its rings creaking harshly against the crazy railing. "How are we going to get down without being detected?" whispered Smith. "We've got to risk it," I said grimly. Without further words, my friend climbed around onto the ladder and commenced to descend. I waited until his head disappeared below the level, and, clumsily enough, prepared to follow him. The hulk at that moment giving an unusually heavy heave, I stumbled, and for one breathless moment looked down upon the glittering surface streaking the darkness beneath me. My foot had slipped, and but that I had a firm grip upon the top rung. That instant, most probably, had marked the end of my share in the fight with Fu-Manchu. As it was, I had a narrow escape. I felt something slip from my hip pocket, but the weird creaking of the ladder, the groans of the laboring hulk, and the lapping of the waves about the staging drowned the sound of the splash as my revolver dropped into the river. Rather white-faced, I think, I joined Smith on the deck. He had witnessed my accident, but "We must risk it," he whispered in my ear. "We dare not turn back now." He plunged into the semi-darkness, making for the cabin, I perforce following. At the bottom of the ladder, we came fully into the light streaming out from the singular apartments at the entrance to which we found ourselves. It was fitted up as a laboratory. A glimpse I had of shelves loaded with jars and bottles, of a table strewn with scientific paraphernalia, with retorts, with tubes of extraordinary shapes, holding living organisms, and with instruments, some of them of a form unknown to my experience. I saw, too, that books, papers, and rolls of parchment littered the bare wooden floor. Then Smith's voice rose above the confused sounds about me, incisive, commanding. "I have you covered, Dr. Fu-Manchu." For Fu-Manchu sat at the table. The picture that he presented at that moment is one which persistently clings in my memory. In his long yellow robe, his mask-like intellectual face bent forward amongst the riot of singular objects upon the table, his great high brow gleaming in the light of the shaded lamp above him, and with the abnormal eyes filmed in green raised to us, he seemed a figure from the realms of delirium. But most amazing circumstance of all, he and his surroundings tallied, almost identically, with the dream picture which had come to me as I lay chained in the cell. Some of the large jars about the place held anatomy specimens. A faint smell of opium hung in the air, and playing with the tassel of one of the cushions upon which, as upon a divan, Fu-Manchu was seated, leaped and chattered a little marmoset. That was an electric moment. I was prepared for anything except for what really happened. The doctor's wonderful evil face betrayed no hint of emotion. The lids flickered over the filmed eyes, and their greenness grew momentarily brighter and filmed over again. "Put up your hands," rapped Smith, "and attempt no tricks." His voice quivered with excitement. "The game's up, Fu-Manchu. Find something to tie him up with, Petrie." I moved forward to Smith's side and was about to pass him in the narrow doorway. The hulk moved beneath our feet like a living thing, groaning, creaking, and the water lapped about the rotten woodwork with a sound infinitely dreary. "Put up your hands," ordered Smith imperatively. Fu-Manchu slowly raised his hands, and a smile dawned upon the impassive features. A smile that had no mirth in it, only menace, revealing as it did his even, discolored teeth but leaving the filmed eyes inanimate, dull, inhuman. He spoke softly, sibilantly. "I would advise Dr. Petrie to glance behind him before he moves." Smith's keen gray eyes never for a moment quitted the speaker. The gleaming barrel moved not a hair's breadth. But I glanced quickly over my shoulder and stifled a cry of pure horror. A wicked, pockmarked face with wolfish fangs bared and jaundiced eyes squinting obliquely into mine was within 2 inches of me. A lean brown hand and arm, the great thews standing up like cords, held a crescent-shaped knife a fraction of an inch above my jugular vein. A slight movement must have dispatched me. A sweep of the fearful weapon, I doubt not, would have severed my head from my body. "Smith," I whispered hoarsely, "don't look around. For God's sake, keep him covered. But a dacoit has his knife at my throat." Then, for the first time, Smith's hand trembled, but his glance never wavered from the malignant, emotionless countenance of Dr. Fu-Manchu. He clenched his teeth hard so that the muscles stood out prominently upon his jaw. I suppose that silence which followed my awful discovery prevailed but a few seconds. To me, those seconds were each a lingering death. There, below, in that groaning hulk, I knew more of icy terror than any of our meetings with the murder group had brought to me before, and through my brain throbbed a thought: the girl had betrayed us. "You supposed that I was alone?" suggested Fu-Manchu. "So I was." Yet no trace of fear had broken through the impassive yellow mask when we had entered. "But my faithful servant followed you," he added. "I thank him. The honors, Mr. Smith, are mine, I think." Smith made no reply. I divined that he was thinking furiously. Fu-Manchu moved his hand to caress the marmoset, which had leaped playfully upon his shoulder, and crouched there jibbing at us in a whistling voice. "Don't stir," said Smith savagely. "I warn you!" Fu-Manchu kept his hand raised. "May I ask you how you discovered my retreat?" he asked. "This hulk has been watched since dawn," lied Smith brazenly. "So?" The doctor's filmed eyes cleared for a moment. "And today you compelled me to burn a house, and you have captured one of my people too. I congratulate you. She would not betray me, though lashed with scorpions." The great gleaming knife was so near to my neck that a sheet of notepaper could scarcely have been slipped between blade and vein, I think. But my heart throbbed even more wildly when I heard those words. "An impasse," said Fu-Manchu. "I have a proposal to make. I assume that you would not accept my word for anything?" "I would not," replied Smith promptly. "Therefore," pursued the Chinaman, and the occasional guttural alone marred his perfect English, "I must accept yours. Of your resources outside this cabin I know nothing. You, I take it, know as little of mine. My Burmese friend and Dr. Petrie will lead the way then. You and I will follow. We will strike out across the marsh for, say, 300 yards. You will then place your pistol on the ground, pledging me your word to leave it there. I shall further require your assurance that you will make no attempt upon me until I have retraced my steps. I and my good servant will withdraw, leaving you, at the expiration of the specified period, to act as you see fit. Is it agreed?" Smith hesitated. Then, "The dacoit must leave his knife also," he stipulated. Fu-Manchu smiled his evil smile again. "Agreed. Shall I lead the way?" "No," rapped Smith. "Petrie and the dacoit first, then you. I last." A guttural word of command from Fu-Manchu, and we left the cabin with its evil odors, its mortuary specimens, and its strange instruments, and in the order arranged mounted to the deck. "It will be awkward on the ladder," said Fu-Manchu. "Dr. Petrie, I will accept your word to adhere to the terms." "I promise," I said, the words almost choking me. We mounted the rising and dipping ladder, all reached the pier, and strode out across the flats, the Chinaman always under close cover of Smith's revolver. Round about our feet, now leaping ahead, now gambolling back, came and went the marmoset. The dacoit, dressed solely in a dark loincloth, walked beside me, carrying his huge knife, and sometimes glancing at me with his bloodlustful eyes. Never before, I venture to say, had an autumn moon lighted such a scene in that place. "Here we part," said Fu-Manchu, and spoke another word to his follower. The man threw his knife upon the ground. "Search him, Petrie," directed Smith. "He may have a second concealed." The doctor consented, and I passed my hands over the man's scanty garments. "Now search Fu-Manchu." This also I did, and never have I experienced a similar sense of revulsion from any human being. I shuddered as though I had touched a venomous reptile. Smith threw down his revolver. "I curse myself for an honorable fool," he said. "No one could dispute my right to shoot you dead where you stand." Knowing him as I did, I could tell from the suppressed passion in Smith's voice that only by his unhesitating acceptance of my friend's word, and implicit faith in his keeping it, had Dr. Fu-Manchu escaped just retribution at that moment. Fiend though he was, I admired his courage. For all this he too must have known. The doctor turned, and with the dacoit walked back. Nayland Smith's next move filled me with surprise. For just as silently I was thanking God for my escape, my friend began shedding his coat, collar, and waistcoat. "Pocket your valuables and do the same," he muttered hoarsely. "We have a poor chance, but we are both fairly fit. Tonight, Petrie, we literally have to run for our lives. We live in a peaceful age, wherein it falls to the lot of few men to owe their survival to their fleetness of foot." At Smith's words, I realized in a flash that such was to be our fate tonight. I have said that the hulk lay off a sort of promontory. East and west, then, we had nothing to hope for. To the south was Fu-Manchu, and even as stripped of our heavier garments we started to run northward, the weird signal of a dacoit rose on the night and was answered again. "3 at least," hissed Smith. 3 armed dacoits. Hopeless. "Take the revolver," I cried. "Smith, it's—" "No!" he rapped through clenched teeth. "A servant of the crown in the East makes his motto, 'Keep your word, though it break your neck.' I don't think we need fear it being used against us. Fu-Manchu avoids noisy methods. So back we ran, over the course by which earlier we had come. It was roughly a mile to the first building, a deserted cottage, and another quarter of a mile to any that was occupied. Our chance of meeting a living soul, other than Fu-Manchu's dacoits, was practically nil. At first we ran easily, for it was the second half-mile that would decide our fate. The professional murderers who pursued us ran like panthers, I knew. And I dare not allow my mind to dwell upon those yellow figures with the curved, gleaming knives. For a long time neither of us looked back. On we ran and on silently, doggedly. Then a hissing breath from Smith warned me what to expect. Should I too look back? Yes. It was impossible to resist the horrid fascination. I threw a quick glance over my shoulder. And never while I live shall I forget what I saw. Two of the pursuing dacoits had outdistanced their fellow or fellows and were actually within 300 yards of us. More like dreadful animals they looked than human beings, running bent forward, with their faces curiously up-tilted. The brilliant moonlight gleamed upon bared teeth, as I could see even at that distance, even in that quick, agonized glance, and it gleamed upon the crescent-shaped knives. "As hard as you can go now," panted Smith. "We must make an attempt to break into the empty cottage. Only chance." I had never in my younger days been a notable runner. For Smith, I cannot speak, but I am confident that the next half-mile was done in time that would not have disgraced a crack man. Not once again did either of us look back. Yard upon yard we raced forward together. My heart seemed to be bursting. My leg muscles throbbed with pain. At last, with the empty cottage in sight, it came to that pass with me, when another 3 yards looks as unattainable as 3 miles. Once I stumbled. "My God!" came from Smith weakly, but I recovered myself. Bare feet pattered close upon our heels, and panting breaths told how even Fu-Manchu's bloodhounds were hard put to it by the killing pace we had made. "Smith," I whispered, "look in front. Someone." As through a red mist I had seen a dark shape detach itself from the shadows of the cottage and merge into them again. It could only be another dacoit, but Smith, not heeding or not hearing my faintly whispered words, crashed open the gate and hurled himself blindly at the door. It burst open before him with a resounding boom, and he pitched forward into the interior darkness. Flat upon the floor he lay, for as, with a last effort, I gained the threshold and dragged myself within, I almost fell over his recumbent body. Madly I snatched at the door. His foot held it open. I kicked the foot away and banged the door to. As I turned, the leading dacoit, his eyes starting from their sockets, his face the face of a demon, leaped wildly through the gateway. That Smith had burst the latch I felt assured, but by some divine accident my weak hands found the bolt. With the last ounce of strength spared to me, I thrust it home in the rusty socket, as a full 6 inches of shining steel split the middle panel and protruded above my head. I dropped, sprawling, beside my friend. A terrific blow shattered every pane of glass in the solitary window, and one of the grinning animal faces looked in. "Sorry, old man," whispered Smith, and his voice was barely audible. Weakly he grasped my hand. "My fault. I shouldn't have let you come." From the corner of the room where the black shadows lay, flicked a long tongue of flame. Muffled staccato came the report, and the yellow face at the window was blotted out. One wild cry ending in a rattling gasp told of a dacoit gone to his account. A gray figure glided past me and was silhouetted against the broken window. Again the pistol sent its message into the night, and again came the reply to tell how well and truly that message had been delivered. In the stillness, intense by sharp contrast, the sound of bare soles pattering upon the path outside stole to me. 2 runners, I thought there were, so that 4 dacoits must have been upon our trail. The room was full of pungent smoke. I staggered to my feet as the gray figure with the revolver turned towards me. Something familiar there was in that long gray garment, and now I perceived why I had thought so. It was my gray raincoat. "Karamaneh," I whispered. And Smith, with difficulty, supporting himself upright and holding fast to the ledge beside the door, muttered something hoarsely, which sounded like, "God bless her." The girl, trembling now, placed her hands upon my shoulders with that quaint, pathetic gesture peculiarly her own. "I followed you," she said. "Did you not know I should follow you? But I had to hide because of another who was following also. I had but just reached this place when I saw you running towards me." She broke off and turned to Smith. "This is your pistol," she said naively. "I found it in your bag. Will you please take it?" He took it without a word. Perhaps he could not trust himself to speak. "Now go, hurry," she said. "You are not safe yet." "But you?" I asked. "You have failed," she replied. "I must go back to him. There is no other way." Strangely sick at heart for a man who has just had a miraculous escape from death, I opened the door. Coatless, disheveled figures, my friend and I stepped out into the moonlight. Hideous under the pale rays lay the two dead men, their glazed eyes upcast to the peace of the blue heavens. Karamaneh had shot to kill, for both had bullets in their brains. If God ever planned a more complex nature than hers, a nature more tumultuous with conflicting passions, I cannot conceive of it. Yet her beauty was of the sweetest, and in some respects she had the heart of a child, this girl who could shoot so straight. "We must send the police tonight," said Smith. "Or the papers. Hurry!" came the girl's voice commandingly from the darkness of the cottage. It was a singular situation. My very soul rebelled against it. But what could we do? "Tell us where we can communicate," began Smith. "Hurry, I shall be suspected. Do you want him to kill me?" We moved away. All was very still now, and the lights glimmered faintly ahead. Not a wisp of cloud brushed the moon's disk. "Good night, Karamaneh," I whispered softly. To pursue further the adventure on the marshes would be a task at once useless and thankless. In its actual and in its dramatic significance, it concluded with our parting from Karamaneh. And in that parting I learned what Shakespeare meant by sweet sorrow. There was a world, I learned, upon the confines of which I stood. A world whose very existence hitherto had been unsuspected. Not the least of the mysteries which peeped from the darkness was the mystery of the heart of Karamaneh. I sought to forget her. I sought to remember her. Indeed, in the latter task I found one more congenial, yet, in the direction and extent of the ideas which it engendered, one that led me to a precipice. East and West may not intermingle. As a student of world policies, as a physician, I admitted, could not deny that truth. Again, if Karamaneh were to be credited, she had come to Fu-Manchu a slave, had fallen into the hands of the raiders, had crossed the desert with the slave drivers, had known the house of the slave dealer. Could it be? With the fading of the crescent of Islam, I had thought such things to have passed. But if it were so? At the mere thought of a girl so deliciously beautiful in the brutal power of slavers, I found myself grinding my teeth, closing my eyes in a futile attempt to blot out the pictures called up. Then, at such times, I would find myself discrediting her story. Again, I would find myself wondering vaguely why such problems persistently haunted my mind. But always my heart had an answer, and I was a medical man who sought to build up a family practice. Who, in short, a very little time ago, had thought himself past the hot follies of youth and entered upon that staid phase of life wherein the daily problems of the medical profession hold absolute sway, and such seductive follies as dark eyes and red lips find no place, are excluded. But it is foreign from the purpose of this plain record to enlist sympathy for the recorder. The topic upon which here I have ventured to touch was one fascinating enough to me. I cannot hope that it holds equal charm for any other. Let us return to that which it is my duty to narrate, and let us forget my brief digression. It is a fact, singular but true, that few Londoners know London. Under the guidance of my friend Nayland Smith, I had learned since his return from Burma how there are haunts in the very heart of the metropolis, whose existence is unsuspected by all but the few, places unknown even to the ubiquitous copy-hunting pressman. Into a quiet thoroughfare not 2 minutes' walk from the pulsing life of Leicester Square, Smith led the way. Before a door sandwiched in between two dingy shop fronts, he paused and turned to me. "Whatever you see or hear," he cautioned, "express no surprise." A cab had dropped us at the corner. We both wore dark suits and fez caps with black silk tassels. My complexion had been artificially reduced to a shade resembling the deep tan of my friend's. He rang the bell beside the door. Almost immediately it was opened by a Negro woman. Gross, hideously ugly, Smith uttered something in voluble Arabic. As a linguist, his attainments were a constant source of surprise. The jargons of the East far and near, he spoke as his mother tongue. The woman immediately displayed the utmost servility, ushering us into an ill-lighted passage with every evidence of profound respect. Following this passage, and passing an inner door, from beyond whence proceeded bursts of discordant music, we entered a little room bare of furniture, with coarse matting for mural decorations, and a patternless red carpet on the floor. In a niche burned a common metal lamp. The negress left us, and close upon her departure entered a very aged man with a long patriarchal beard, who greeted my friend with dignified courtesy. Following a brief conversation, the aged Arab, for such he appeared to be, drew aside a strip of matting, revealing a dark recess. Placing his finger upon his lips, he silently invited us to enter. We did so, and the mat was dropped behind us. The sounds of crude music were now much plainer, and as Smith slipped a little shutter aside, I gave a start of surprise. Beyond lay a fairly large apartment, having divans or low seats around 3 of its walls. These divans were occupied by a motley company of Turks, Egyptians, Greeks, and others, and I noted 2 Chinese. Most of them smoked cigarettes, and some were drinking. A girl was performing a sinuous dance upon the square carpet occupying the center of the floor, accompanied by a young Negro woman upon a guitar, and by several members of the assembly who clapped their hands to the music or hummed a low, monotonous melody. Shortly after our entrance into the passage, the dance terminated, and the dancer fled through a curtained door at the farther end of the room. A buzz of conversation arose. "It is a sort of combined wakale and place of entertainment for a certain class of Oriental residents in or visiting London," Smith whispered. "The old gentleman who has just left us is the proprietor or host. I have been here before on several occasions, but have always drawn blank." He was peering out eagerly into the strange clubroom. "Whom do you expect to find here?" I asked. "It is a recognized meeting place," said Smith in my ear. "It is almost a certainty that some of the Fu-Manchu group use it at times." Curiously, I surveyed all these faces which were visible from the spy hole. My eyes rested particularly upon the 2 Chinamen. "Do you recognize anyone?" I whispered. "Shh!" Smith was craning his neck so as to command a sight of the doorway. He obstructed my view, and only by his tense attitude and some subtle wave of excitement which he communicated to me did I know that a new arrival was entering. The hum of conversation died away, and in the ensuing silence I heard the rustle of draperies. The newcomer was a woman then. Fearful of making any noise, I yet managed to get my eyes to the level of the shutter. A woman in an elegant, flame-colored opera cloak was crossing the floor and coming in the direction of the spot where we were concealed. She wore a soft silk scarf about her head, a fold partly draped across her face. A momentary view I had of her, and wildly incongruous she looked in that place, and she had disappeared from sight, having approached someone invisible who sat upon the divan immediately beneath our point of vantage. From the way in which the company gazed towards her, I divined that she was no habitué of the place, but that her presence there was as greatly surprising to those in the room as it was to me. Whom could she be, this elegant lady who visited such a haunt, who it would seem was so anxious to disguise her identity, but who was dressed for a society function rather than for a midnight expedition of so unusual a character? I began a whispered question, but Smith tugged at my arm to silence me. His excitement was intense. Had his keener powers enabled him to recognize the unknown? A faint but most peculiar perfume stole to my nostrils, a perfume which seemed to contain the very soul of Eastern mystery. Only one woman known to me used that perfume, Karamaneh. Then it was she. At last, my friend's vigilance had been rewarded. Eagerly, I bent forward. Smith literally quivered in anticipation of a discovery. Again, the strange perfume was wafted to our hiding place, and glancing neither to right nor left, I saw Karamaneh, for that it was she I no longer doubted, recross the room and disappear. "The man she spoke to," hissed Smith. "We must see him. We must have him." He pulled the mat aside and stepped out into the anteroom. It was empty. Down the passage he led, and we were almost come to the door of the big room when it was thrown open and a man came rapidly out, opened the street door before Smith could reach him, and was gone, slamming it fast. I can swear that we were not 4 seconds behind him, but when we gained the street it was empty. Our quarry had disappeared as if by magic. A big car was just turning the corner towards Leicester Square. "That is the girl," rapped Smith. "But where in heaven's name is the man to whom she brought the message? I would give £100 to know what business is afoot. To think that we have had such an opportunity and have thrown it away." Angry and nonplussed, he stood at the corner, looking in the direction of the crowded thoroughfare into which the car had been driven, tugging at the lobe of his ear, as was his habit in such moments of perplexity, and sharply clicking his teeth together. I too was very thoughtful. Clues were few enough in those days of our war with that giant antagonist. The mere thought that our trifling error of judgment tonight in tarrying a moment too long might mean the victory of Fu-Manchu, might mean the turning of the balance, which a wise providence had adjusted between the white and yellow races, was appalling. To Smith and me, who knew something of the secret influences at work to overthrow the Indian Empire. To place, it might be, The whole of Europe and America beneath an Eastern rule, it seemed that a great yellow hand was stretched out over London. Dr. Fu-Manchu was a menace to the civilized world, yet his very existence remained unsuspected by the millions whose fate he sought to command. "Into what dark scheme have we had a glimpse?" said Smith. "What state secret is to be filched? What faithful servant of the British Raj to be spirited away? Upon whom now has Fu-Manchu set his death seal?" Karamaneh on this occasion may not have been acting as an emissary of the doctors. I feel assured that she was, Petrie. Of the many whom this yellow cloud may at any moment envelop, to which one did her message refer? The man's instructions were urgent. Witness his hasty departure. Curse it! He dashed his right clenched fist into the palm of his left hand. I never had a glimpse of his face, first to last, to think of the hours I have spent in that place, in anticipation of just such a meeting, only to bungle the opportunity when it arose. Scarce heeding what course we followed, we had come now to Piccadilly Circus and had walked out into the heart of the night's traffic. I just dragged Smith aside in time to save him from the off-front wheel of a big Mercedes. Then the traffic was blocked, and we found ourselves dangerously penned in amidst the press of vehicles. Somehow we extricated ourselves, jeered at by taxi drivers, who naturally took us for two simple Oriental visitors, and just before that impassable barrier, the arm of a London policeman was lowered and the stream moved on. A faint breath of perfume became perceptible to me. The cabs and cars about us were actually beginning to move again, and there was nothing for it but a hasty retreat to the curb. I could not pause to glance behind, but instinctively I knew that someone who used that rare, fragrant essence, was leaning from the window of the car. "Andaman, second," floated a soft whisper. We gained the pavement as the pent-up traffic roared upon its way. Smith had not noticed the perfume worn by the unseen occupant of the car, had not detected the whispered words. But I had no reason to doubt my senses, and I knew beyond question that Fu-Manchu's lovely slave, Karamaneh, had been within a yard of us, had recognized us, and had uttered those words for our guidance. On regaining my rooms, we devoted a whole hour to considering what Andaman second could possibly mean. "Hang it all!" cried Smith. "It might mean anything. The result of a race, for instance." He burst into one of his rare laughs and began to stuff broad-cut mixture into his briar. I could see that he had no intention of turning in. "I can think of no one of note in London at present upon whom it is likely that Fu-Manchu would make an attempt," he said, "except ourselves." We began methodically to go through the long list of names which we had compiled and to review our elaborate notes. When at last I turned in, the night had given place to a new day. But sleep evaded me, and Andaman second danced like a mocking phantom through my brain. Then I heard the telephone bell. I heard Smith speaking. A minute afterwards he was in my room, his face very grim. "I knew as well as if I'd seen it with my own eyes that some black business was afoot last night," he said. "And it was, within pistol shot of us. Someone has got at Frank Norris West. Inspector Weymouth has just been on the phone." "Norris West!" I cried. "The American aviator and inventor of the West Aero Torpedo, yes. He's been offering it to the English War Office, and they have delayed too long." I got out of bed. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the potentialities have attracted the attention of Dr. Fu-Manchu." Those words operated electrically. I do not know how long I was in dressing, how long a time elapsed ere the cab for which Smith had phoned arrived, how many precious minutes were lost upon the journey. But, in a nervous whirl, these things slipped into the past, like the telegraph poles seen from the window of an express, and, still in that tense state, we came upon the scene of this newest outrage. Mr. Norris West, whose lean, stoic face had latterly figured so often in the daily press, lay upon the floor in the little entrance hall of his chambers, flat upon his back, with the telephone receiver in his hand. The outer door had been forced by the police. They had had to remove a piece of the paneling to get at the bolt. A medical man was leaning over the recumbent figure in the striped pajama suit, and Detective Inspector Weymouth stood watching him as Smith and I entered. "He has been heavily drugged," said the doctor, sniffing at West's lips. "But I cannot say what drug has been used. It isn't chloroform or anything of that nature. He can safely be left to sleep it off, I think." I agreed after a brief examination. "It's most extraordinary," said Weymouth. "He rang up the yard about an hour ago and said his chambers had been invaded by Chinamen. Then the man at the phone plainly heard him fall. When we got here, his front door was bolted, as you've seen, and the windows are 3 floors up. Nothing is disturbed. The plans of the aero torpedo? Rapped Smith. I take it they are in the safe in his bedroom, replied the detective. And that is locked all right. I think he must have taken an overdose of something and had illusions. But in case there was anything in what he mumbled, you could hardly understand him. I thought it as well to send for you. Quite right, said Smith rapidly. His eyes shone like steel. Lay him on the bed, Inspector. It was done, and my friend walked into the bedroom. Save that the bed was disordered, showing that West had been sleeping in it. There were no evidences of the extraordinary invasion mentioned by the drugged man. It was a small room. The chambers were of that kind which are let furnished, and very neat. A safe with a combination lock stood in a corner. The window was open about a foot at the top. Smith tried the safe and found it fast. He stood for a moment clicking his teeth together, by which I knew him to be perplexed. He walked over to the window and threw it up. We both looked out. You see, came Weymouth's voice, it is altogether too far from the court below for our cunning Chinese friends to have fixed a ladder with one of their bamboo rod arrangements. And even if they could get up there, it's too far down from the roof, 2 more stories, for them to have fixed it from there. Smith nodded thoughtfully, at the same time trying the strength of an iron bar, which ran from side to side of the windowsill. Suddenly he stooped, with a sharp exclamation. Bending over his shoulder, I saw what it was that had attracted his attention. Clearly imprinted upon the dust-coated gray stone of the sill was a confused series of marks. Tracks, call them what you will. Smith straightened himself and turned a wondering look upon me. What is it, Petrie? He said amazedly. Some kind of bird has been here, and recently. Inspector Weymouth in turn examined the marks. I never saw bird tracks like these, Mr. Smith, he muttered. Smith was tugging at the lobe of his ear. No, he returned reflectively. Come to think of it, neither did I. He twisted around, looking at the man on the bed. Do you think it was all an illusion? Asked the detective. What about those marks on the windowsill? Jerked Smith. He began restlessly pacing about the room, sometimes stopping before the locked safe and frequently glancing at Norris West. Suddenly he walked out and briefly examined the other apartments, only to return again to the bedroom. Petrie, he said, we are losing valuable time. West must be aroused. Inspector Weymouth stared. Smith turned to me impatiently. The doctor summoned by the police had gone. Is there no means of arousing him, Petrie? He said. Doubtless, I replied. He could be revived if one but knew what drug he had taken. My friend began his restless pacing again, and suddenly pounced upon a little file of tabloids which had been hidden behind some books on a shelf near the bed. He uttered a triumphant exclamation. See what we have here, Petrie? He directed, handing the file to me. It bears no label. I crushed one of the tabloids in my palm and applied my tongue to the powder. Some preparation of chloral hydrate, I pronounced. A sleeping draught? Suggested Smith eagerly. We might try, I said, and scribbled a formula upon a leaf of my notebook. I asked Weymouth to send the man who accompanied him to call up the nearest chemist and procure the antidote. During the man's absence, Smith stood contemplating the unconscious inventor, a peculiar expression upon his bronzed face. Andaman, second, he muttered. Shall we find the key to the riddle here, I wonder? Inspector Weymouth, who had concluded, I think, that the mysterious telephone call was due to mental aberration on the part of Norris West, was gnawing at his mustache impatiently when his assistant returned. I administered the powerful restorative, and although, as later transpired, chloral was not responsible for West's condition, the antidote operated successfully. Norris West struggled into a sitting position and looked about him with haggard eyes. The Chinaman, he muttered. He sprang to his feet, glaring wildly at Smith and me, reeled and almost fell. It is all right, I said, supporting him. I'm a doctor. You have been unwell. Have the police come? He burst out. The safe! Try the safe! It's all right, said Inspector Weymouth. The safe is locked. Unless someone else knows the combination, there's nothing to worry about. No one else knows it, said West, and staggered unsteadily to the safe. Clearly his mind was in a dazed condition, but, setting his jaw with a curious expression of grim determination, he collected his thoughts and opened the safe. He bent down, looking in. In some way, the knowledge came to me that the curtain was about to rise on a new and surprising act in the Fu-Manchu drama. God, he whispered. We could scarcely hear him. The plans are gone. I have never seen a man quite so surprised as Inspector Weymouth. This is absolutely incredible, he said. There's only one door to your chambers. We found it bolted from the inside. Yes, groaned West, pressing his hand to his forehead. I bolted it myself at 11 o'clock when I came in. No human being could climb up or down to your windows. The plans of the aero torpedo were inside a safe. I put them there myself, said West, on returning from the War Office, and I had occasion to consult them after I had come in and bolted the door. I returned them to the safe and locked it. That it was still locked you saw for yourselves, and no one else in the world knows the combination. But the plans have gone, said Weymouth. It's magic. How was it done? What happened last night, sir? What did you mean when you rang us up? Smith, during this colloquy, was pacing rapidly up and down the room. He turned abruptly to the aviator. Every fact you can remember, Mr. West, please, he said tersely, and be as brief as you possibly can. I came in, as I said, explained West, about 11 o'clock, and having made some notes relating to an interview arranged for this morning, I locked the plans in the safe and turned in. There was no one hidden anywhere in your chambers? Snapped Smith. There was not, replied West. I looked. I invariably do. Almost immediately I went to sleep. How many chloral tabloids did you take? I interrupted. Norris West turned to me with a slow smile. You're cute, Doctor, he said. I took 2. It's a bad habit, but I can't sleep without. They are specially made up for me by a firm in Philadelphia. How long sleep lasted, when it became filled with uncanny dreams, and when those dreams merged into reality, I do not know, shall never know, I suppose. But out of the dreamless void, a face came to me, closer, and peered into mine. I was in that curious condition wherein one knows that one is dreaming and seeks to awaken, to escape. But a nightmare-like oppression held me. So I must lie and gaze into the seared yellow face that hung over me, for it would drop so close that I could trace the cicatrized scar running from the left ear to the corner of the mouth and drawing up the lip like the lip of a snarling cur. I could look into the malignant, jaundiced eyes. I could hear the dim whispering of the distorted mouth, whispering that seemed to counsel something evil. That whispering intimacy was indescribably repulsive. Then the wicked yellow face would be withdrawn and would recede until it became as a pin's head in the darkness far above me, almost like a glutinous liquid thing. Somehow I got upon my feet, or dreamed I did. God knows where dreaming ended and reality began. Gentlemen, maybe you'll conclude I went mad last night, but as I stood holding onto the bed rail, I heard the blood throbbing through my arteries with a noise like a screw propeller. I started laughing. The laughter issued from my lips with a shrill whistling sound that pierced me with physical pain and seemed to wake the echoes of the whole block. I thought myself I was going mad, and I tried to command my will to break the power of the chloral, for I concluded that I had accidentally taken an overdose. Then the walls of my bedroom started to recede, till at last I stood holding onto a bed which had shrunk to the size of a doll's cot in the middle of a room like Trafalgar Square. That window yonder was such a long way off I could scarcely see it, but I could just detect a Chinaman, the owner of the evil yellow face, creeping through it. He was followed by another who was enormously tall, so tall that as they came towards me, and it seemed to take them something like half an hour to cross this incredible apartment in my dream, the second Chinaman seemed to tower over me like a cypress tree. I looked up to his face, his wicked, hairless face. Mr. Smith, whatever age I live to, I'll never forget that face I saw last night. Or did I see it? God knows. The pointed chin, the great dome of a forehead, and the eyes, heavens above, the huge green eyes. He shook like a sick man, and I glanced at Smith significantly. Inspector Weymouth was stroking his mustache, and his mingled expression of incredulity and curiosity was singular to behold. The pumping of my blood, continued West, seemed to be bursting my body. The room kept expanding and contracting. One time the ceiling would be pressing down on my head, and the Chinamen, sometimes I thought there were 2 of them, sometimes 20, became dwarfs. The next instant it shot up like the roof of a cathedral. Can I be awake? I whispered. Or am I dreaming? My whisper went sweeping in windy echoes about the walls and was lost in the shadowy distances up under the invisible roof. You are dreaming? Yes. You are. It was the Chinaman with the green eyes who was addressing me, and the words that he uttered appeared to occupy an immeasurable time in the utterance. But at will I can render the subjective objective. I don't think I can have dreamed those singular words, gentlemen. And then he fixed the green eyes upon me, the blazing green eyes. I made no attempt to move. They seemed to be draining me of something vital, bleeding me of every drop of mental power. The whole nightmare room grew green, and I felt that I was being absorbed into its greenness. I can see what you think. And even in my delirium, if it was delirium, I thought the same. Now comes the climax of my experience. My vision. I don't know what to call it. I saw some words issuing from my own mouth. Inspector Weymouth coughed discreetly. Smith whisked round upon him. "This will be outside your experience, Inspector, I know," he said. "But Mr. Norris West's statement does not surprise me in the least. I know to what the experience was due." Weymouth stared incredulously, but a dawning perception of the truth was come to me, too. How I saw a sound I just won't attempt to explain. I simply tell you I saw it. Somehow I knew I had betrayed myself, given something away. "You gave away the secret of the lock combination," rapped Smith. Grunted Weymouth. But West went on hoarsely. Just before the blank came a name flashed before my eyes. It was Bayard Taylor. At that I interrupted West. "I understand," I cried. "I understand. Another name has just occurred to me, Mr. West, that of the Frenchman, Moreau." "You have solved the mystery," said Smith. "It was natural Mr. West should have thought of the American traveler Bayard Taylor, though. Moreau's book is purely scientific. He has probably never read it." "I fought with the stupor that was overcoming me," continued West, striving to associate that vaguely familiar name with the fantastic things through which I moved. It seemed to me that the room was empty again. I made for the hall, for the telephone. I could scarcely drag my feet along. It seemed to take me half an hour to get there. I remember calling up Scotland Yard, and I remember no more. There was a short, tense interval. In some respects, I was nonplussed. But frankly, I think Inspector Weymouth considered West insane. Smith, his hands locked behind his back, stared out of the window. "Andaman second," he said suddenly. "Weymouth, when is the first train to Tilbury?" 5:22 from Fenchurch Street, replied the Scotland Yard man promptly. "Too late," rapped my friend. "Jump in a taxi and pick up 2 good men to leave for China at once. Then go and charter a special to Tilbury to leave in 25 minutes. Order another cab to wait outside for me." Weymouth was palpably amazed, but Smith's tone was imperative. The inspector departed hastily. I stared at Smith, not comprehending what prompted this singular course. "Now that you can think clearly, Mr. West," he said, "of what does your experience remind you? The errors of perception regarding time, the idea of seeing a sound, the illusion that the room alternately increased and diminished in size, your fit of laughter, and the recollection of the name Bayard Taylor. Since evidently you are familiar with that author's work, The Land of the Saracen, is it not? These symptoms of the attack should be familiar, I think." Norris West pressed his hands to his evidently aching head. "Bayard Taylor's book," he said dully. "Yes, I know of what my brain sought to remind me. Taylor's account of his experience under hashish. Mr. Smith, someone doped me with hashish." Smith nodded grimly. "Cannabis indica," I said. "Indian hemp. That is what you were drugged with. I have no doubt that now you experience a feeling of nausea and intense thirst, with aching in the muscles, particularly the deltoid. I think you must have taken at least 15 grains." Smith stopped his perambulations immediately in front of West, looking into his dulled eyes. "Someone visited your chambers last night," he said slowly, "and for your chloral tabloid substituted some containing hashish, or perhaps not pure hashish. Fu-Manchu is a profound chemist." Norris West started. "Someone substituted," he began. "Exactly," said Smith, looking at him keenly. "Someone who was here yesterday. Have you any idea whom it could have been?" West hesitated. "I had a visitor in the afternoon," he said, seemingly speaking the words unwillingly. "But a lady?" jerked Smith. "I suggest that it was a lady." West nodded. "You're quite right," he admitted. "I don't know how you arrived at the conclusion, but a lady whose acquaintance I made recently, a foreign lady." "Karamaneh," snapped Smith. "I don't know what you mean in the least, but she came here, knowing this to be my present address, to ask me to protect her from a mysterious man who had followed her right from Charing Cross. She said he was down in the lobby, and naturally, I asked her to wait here whilst I went and sent him about his business. He laughed shortly. I am over-old, he said, to be guided by a woman. You spoke just now of someone called Fu-Manchu. Is that the crook I'm indebted to for the loss of my plans? I've had attempts made by agents of 2 European governments, but a Chinaman is a novelty. This Chinaman, Smith assured him, is the greatest novelty of his age. You recognize your symptoms now from Bayard Taylor's account? Mr. West's statement, I said, ran closely parallel with portions of Moreau's book on hashish hallucinations. Only Fu-Manchu, I think, would have thought of employing Indian hemp. I doubt, though, if it was pure cannabis indica. At any rate, it acted as an opiate. And drugged Mr. West, interrupted Smith, sufficiently to enable Fu-Manchu to enter unobserved, whilst it produced symptoms which rendered him an easy subject for the doctor's influence. It is difficult in this case to separate hallucination from reality, but I think, Mr. West, that Fu-Manchu must have exercised an hypnotic influence upon your drugged brain. We have evidence that he dragged from you the secret of the combination. God knows we have, said West. But who is this Fu-Manchu, and how in the name of wonder did he get into my chambers? Smith pulled out his watch. That, he said rapidly. I cannot delay to explain if I'm to intercept the man who has the plans. Come along, Petrie. We must be at Tilbury within the hour. There is just a bare chance. It was with my mind in a condition of unique perplexity that I hurried with Nayland Smith into the cab, which waited and dashed off through the streets, in which the busy life of London just stirred into being. I suppose I need not say that I could penetrate no farther into this, Fu-Manchu's latest plot, than the drugging of Norris West with hashish. Of his having been so drugged with Indian hemp, that is, converted temporarily into a maniac, would have been evident to any medical man who had heard his statement and noted the distressing after-effects which conclusively pointed to Indian hemp poisoning. Knowing something of the Chinese doctor's powers, I could understand that he might have extracted from West the secret of the combination by sheer force of will, whilst the American was under the influence of the drug. But I could not understand how Fu-Manchu had gained access to locked chambers on the 3rd story of a building. Smith, I said, those bird tracks on the windowsill, they furnish the key to a mystery which is puzzling me. They do, said Smith, glancing impatiently at his watch. Consult your memories of Dr. Fu-Manchu's habits, especially your memories of his pets. I reviewed in my mind the creatures gruesome and terrible which surrounded the Chinaman, the scorpions, the bacteria, the noxious things which were the weapons wherewith he visited death upon whomsoever opposed the establishment of a potential yellow empire. But no one of them could account for the imprints upon the dust of West's windowsill. You puzzle me, Smith, I confessed. There is much in this extraordinary case that puzzles me. I can think of nothing to account for the marks. Have you thought of Fu-Manchu's marmoset? Asked Smith. The monkey! I cried. They were the footprints of a small ape, my friend continued. For a moment I was deceived as you were, and believed them to be the tracks of a large bird. But I have seen the footprints of apes before now, and a marmoset, though an American variety I believe, is not unlike some of the apes of Burma. I am still in the dark, I said. It is pure hypothesis, continued Smith. But here is the theory. In lieu of a better one, it covers the facts. The marmoset, and it is contrary from the character of Fu-Manchu to keep any creature for mere amusement, is trained to perform certain duties. You observe the waterspout running up beside the window. You observe the iron bar intended to prevent a window cleaner from falling out. For an ape, the climb from the court below to the sill above was a simple one. He carried a cord, probably attached to his body. He climbed onto the sill, over the bar, and climbed down again. By means of this cord, a rope was pulled up over the bar. By means of the rope, one of those ladders of silk and bamboo. One of the doctor's servants ascended, probably to ascertain if the hashish had acted successfully. That was the yellow dream face which West saw bending over him. Then followed the doctor, and to his giant will the drugged brain of West was a pliant instrument which he bent to his own ends. The court would be deserted at that hour of the night, and, in any event, directly after the ascent the ladder probably was pulled up, only to be lowered again when West had revealed the secret of his own safe and Fu-Manchu had secured the plans. The reclosing of the safe and the removing of the hashish tabloids, leaving no clue beyond the delirious ravings of a drug slave, for so anyone unacquainted with the East must have construed West's story, is particularly characteristic. His own tabloids were returned, of course. The sparing of his life alone is a refinement of art which points to a past master. Karamaneh was the decoy again? I said shortly. Certainly. Hers was the task to ascertain West's habits and to substitute the tabloids. She it was who waited in the luxurious car, infinitely less likely to attract attention at that hour in that place than a modest taxi, and received the stolen plans. She did her work well. Poor Karamaneh. She had no alternative. I said I would have given £100 for a sight of the messenger's face, the man to whom she handed them. I would give 1,000 now. Andaman second, I said. What did she mean? Then it has not dawned upon you? Cried Smith excitedly, as the cab turned into the station. The Andaman, of the Oriental Navigation Company's line, leaves Tilbury with the next tide for China ports. Our man is a second-class passenger. I am wiring to delay her departure, and the special should get us to the docks inside of 40 minutes. Very vividly, I can reconstruct in my mind that dash to the docks through the early autumn morning, my friend being invested with extraordinary powers from the highest authorities. By Inspector Weymouth's instructions, the line had been cleared all the way. Something of the tremendous importance of Nayland Smith's mission came home to me as we hurried onto the platform, escorted by the station master and the 5 of us, for Weymouth had 2 other CID men with him, took our seats in the special. Off we went on top speed, roaring through stations, where a glimpse might be had of wondering officials upon the platforms, for a special train was a novelty on the line. All ordinary traffic arrangements were held up until we had passed through, and we reached Tilbury in time, which I doubt not constituted a record. There at the docks was the great liner, delayed in her passage to the Far East by the will of my royally empowered companion. It was novel and infinitely exciting. Mr. Commissioner Nayland Smith? Said the captain interrogatively, when we were shown into his room, and looked from one to another and back to the telegraph form which he held in his hand. The same, Captain, said my friend briskly. I shall not detain you a moment. I am instructing the authorities at all ports east of Suez to apprehend one of your second-class passengers, should he leave the ship. He is in possession of plans which practically belong to the British government. Why not arrest him now? Asked the seaman bluntly. Because I don't know him. All second-class passengers' baggage will be searched as they land. I am hoping something from that, if all else fails. But I want you privately to instruct your stewards to watch any passenger of Oriental nationality and to cooperate with the 2 Scotland Yard men who are joining you for the voyage. I look to you to recover these plans, Captain. I will do my best, the captain assured him. Then, from amid the heterogeneous group on the dockside, we were watching the liner depart, and Nayland Smith's expression was a very singular one. Inspector Weymouth stood with us, a badly puzzled man. Then occurred the extraordinary incident which to this day remains inexplicable, for clearly heard by all 3 of us, a guttural voice said, "Another victory for China, Mr. Nayland Smith?" I turned as though I had been stung. Smith turned also. My eyes passed from face to face of the group about us. None was familiar. No one apparently had moved away. But the voice was the voice of Dr. Fu-Manchu. As I write of it now, I can appreciate the difference between that happening, as it appealed to us, and as it must appeal to you, who merely read of it. It is beyond my powers to convey the sense of the uncanny which the episode created. Yet even as I think of it, I feel again, though in lesser degree, the chill which seemed to creep through my veins that day. For my brief history of the wonderful and evil man who once walked, by the way unsuspected, in the midst of the people of England, near whom you personally may at some time unwittingly have been, I am aware that much must be omitted. I have no space for lengthy examinations of the many points, but ill-illuminated, with which it is dotted. This incident at the docks is but one such point. Another is the singular vision which appeared to me whilst I lay in the cellar of the house near Windsor. It has since struck me that it possessed peculiarities akin to those of a hashish hallucination. Can it be that we were drugged on that occasion with Indian hemp? Cannabis indica is a treacherous narcotic, as every medical man knows full well, but Fu-Manchu's knowledge of the drug was far in advance of our slow science. West's experience proved so much. I may have neglected opportunities. Later you shall judge if I did so. Opportunities to glean for the West some of the strange knowledge of the secret East. Perhaps at a future time I may rectify my errors. Perhaps that wisdom, the wisdom stored up by Fu-Manchu, is lost forever. There is, however, at least a bare possibility of its survival in part, and I do not wholly despair of one day publishing a scientific sequel to this record of our dealings with the Chinese doctor. Time wore on and seemingly brought us no nearer, or very little nearer, to our goal. So carefully had my friend Nayland Smith excluded the matter from the press that, whilst public interest was much engaged with some of the events in the skein of mystery which he had come from Burma to unravel, outside the Secret Service and the Special Department of Scotland Yard, few people recognized that the several murders, robberies, and disappearances formed each a link in a chain. Fewer still were aware that a baneful presence was in our midst, that a past master of the evil arts lay concealed somewhere in the metropolis, searched for by the keenest wits which the authorities could direct to the task, but eluding all, triumphant, contemptuous. One link in that chain Smith himself for long failed to recognize. Yet it was a big and important link. "Petrie," he said to me one morning, "listen to this." In sight of Shanghai, a clear, dark night. On board the deck of a junk passing close to seaward of the Andaman, a blue flare started up. A minute later, there was a cry of, "Man overboard!" Mr. Lewin, the chief officer who was in charge, stopped the engines. A boat was put out, but no one was recovered. There are sharks in these waters. A fairly heavy sea was running. Inquiry showed the missing man to be a James Edwards, second class, booked to Shanghai. I think the name was assumed. The man was some sort of Oriental, and we had had him under close observation. "That's the end of their report," exclaimed Smith. He referred to the two CID men who had joined the Andaman at the moment of her departure from Tilbury. He carefully lighted his pipe. "Is it a victory for China, Petrie?" he said softly. "Until the Great War reveals her secret resources, and I pray that the day be not in my time, we shall never know," I replied. Smith began striding up and down the room. "Whose name," he jerked abruptly, "stands now at the head of our danger list?" He referred to a list which we had compiled of the notable men intervening between the evil genius who secretly had invaded London and the triumph of his cause, the triumph of the yellow races. I glanced at our notes. "Lord Southery," I replied. Smith tossed the morning paper across to me. "Look," he said shortly, "he's dead." I read the account of the peer's death and glanced at the long obituary notice, but no more than glanced at it. He had but recently returned from the East, and now, after a short illness, had died from some affection of the heart. There had been no intimation that his illness was of a serious nature, and even Smith, who watched over his flock, the flock threatened by the wolf, Fu-Manchu, with jealous zeal, had not suspected that the end was so near. "Do you think he died a natural death, Smith?" I asked. My friend reached across the table and rested the tip of a long finger upon one of the subheadings to the account. "Sir Frank Narcombe summoned too late." "You see," said Smith, "Southery died during the night, but Sir Frank Narcombe, arriving a few minutes later, unhesitatingly pronounced death to be due to syncope, and seems to have noticed nothing suspicious." I looked at him thoughtfully. "Sir Frank is a great physician," I said slowly, "but we must remember he would be looking for nothing suspicious." "We must remember," rapped Smith, "that if Dr. Fu-Manchu is responsible for Southery's death, except to the eye of an expert, there would be nothing suspicious to see. Fu-Manchu leaves no clues." "Are you going around?" I asked. Smith shrugged his shoulders. "I think not," he replied. "Either a greater one than Fu-Manchu has taken Lord Southery, or the Yellow Doctor has done his work so well that no trace remains of his presence in the matter." Leaving his breakfast untasted, he wandered aimlessly about the room, littering the hearth with matches as he constantly relighted his pipe, which went out every few minutes. "It's no good, Petrie," he burst out suddenly. "It cannot be a coincidence. We must go around and see him." An hour later, we stood in the silent room, with its drawn blinds and its deathful atmosphere, looking down at the pale, intellectual face of Henry Stradwick, Lord Southery, the greatest engineer of his day. The mind that lay behind that splendid brow had planned the construction of the railway for which Russia had paid so great a price, had conceived the scheme for the canal which, in the near future, was to bring two great continents a full week's journey nearer one to the other, but now it would plan no more. He had latterly developed symptoms of angina pectoris, explained the family physician. But I had not anticipated a fatal termination so soon. I was called about 2 o'clock this morning and found Lord Southery in a dangerously exhausted condition. I did all that was possible, and Sir Frank Narcombe was sent for. But shortly before his arrival, the patient expired. I understand, Doctor, that you had been treating Lord Southery for angina pectoris, I said. Yes, was the reply, for some months. You regard the circumstances of his end as entirely consistent with a death from that cause? Certainly. Do you observe anything unusual yourself? Sir Frank Narcombe quite agrees with me. There is surely no room for doubt. No, said Smith, tugging reflectively at the lobe of his left ear. We do not question the accuracy of your diagnosis in any way, sir. The physician seemed puzzled. But am I not right in supposing that you are connected with the police? Asked the physician. Neither Dr. Petrie nor myself are in any way connected with the police, answered Smith. But nevertheless, I look to you to regard our recent questions as confidential. As we were leaving the house, hushed awesomely in deference to the unseen visitor who had touched Lord Southery with gray, cold fingers, Smith paused, detaining a black-coated man who passed us on the stairs. You were Lord Southery's valet? The man bowed. Were you in the room at the moment of his fatal seizure? I was, sir. Did you see or hear anything unusual? Anything unaccountable? Nothing, sir. No strange sounds outside the house, for instance? The man shook his head, and Smith, taking my arm, passed out into the street. Perhaps this business is making me imaginative, he said, but there seems to be something tainting the air in yonder. Something peculiar to houses whose doors bear the invisible death mark of Fu-Manchu. You are right, Smith, I cried. I hesitated to mention the matter, but I, too, have developed some other sense which warns me of the doctor's presence. Although there is not a scrap of confirmatory evidence, I am as sure that he has brought about Lord Southery's death as if I had seen him strike the blow. It was in that torturing frame of mind, chained, helpless, in our ignorance, or by reason of the Chinaman's supernormal genius, that we lived throughout the ensuing days. My friend began to look like a man consumed by a burning fever, yet we could not act. In the growing dark of an evening shortly following, I stood idly turning over some of the works exposed for sale outside a second-hand bookseller's in New Oxford Street. One dealing with the secret societies of China struck me as being likely to prove instructive, and I was about to call the shopman when I was startled to feel a hand clutch my arm. I turned around rapidly and was looking into the darkly beautiful eyes of Karamaneh. She, whom I had seen in so many guises, was dressed in a perfectly fitting walking habit and had much of her wonderful hair concealed beneath a fashionable hat. She glanced about her apprehensively. Quick, come round the corner, I must speak to you, she said, her musical voice thrilling with excitement. I never was quite master of myself in her presence. He must have been a man of ice who could have been, I think, for her beauty had all the bouquet of rarity. She was a mystery, and mystery adds charm to a woman. Probably she should have been under arrest, but I know I would have risked much to save her from it. As we turned into a quiet thoroughfare, she stopped and said, I am in distress. You have often asked me to enable you to capture Dr. Fu-Manchu. I am prepared to do so. I could scarcely believe that I heard right. Your brother, I began. She seized my arm entreatingly, looking into my eyes. You are a doctor, she said. I want you to come and see him now. What? Is he in London? He is at the house of Dr. Fu-Manchu. And you would have me accompany me there? Yes. Nayland Smith, I doubted not, would have counseled me against trusting my life in the hands of this girl with the pleading eyes. Yet I did so, and with little hesitation, shortly we were traveling eastward in a closed cab. Karamaneh was very silent, but always when I turned to her, I found her big eyes fixed upon me with an expression in which there was pleading, in which there was sorrow, in which there was something else, something indefinable, yet strangely disturbing. The cabman she had directed to drive to the lower end of the commercial road, the neighborhood of the new docks, and the scene of one of our early adventures with Dr. Fu-Manchu. The mantle of dusk had closed about the squalid activity of the East End streets as we neared our destination. Aliens of every shade of color were about us now, emerging from burrow-like alleys into the glare of the lamps upon the main road. In the short space of the drive, we had passed from the bright world of the West into the dubious underworld of the East. I do not know that Karamaneh moved, but in sympathy, as we neared the abode of the sinister Chinaman, she crept nearer to me, and when the cab was discharged, and together we walked down a narrow turning leading riverward. She clung to me fearfully, hesitated, and even seemed upon the point of turning back. But, overcoming her fear or repugnance, she led on, through a maze of alleyways and courts, wherein I hopelessly lost my bearings, so that it came home to me how wholly I was in the hands of this girl whose history was so full of shadows, whose real character was so inscrutable, whose beauty, whose charm truly might mask the cunning of a serpent. I spoke to her. Shh! She laid her hand upon my arm, enjoining me to silence. The high, drab brick wall of what looked like some part of a dock building loomed above us in the darkness, and the indescribable stenches of the lower Thames were borne to my nostrils through a gloomy, tunnel-like opening, beyond which whispered the river. The muffled clangor of waterside activity was about us. I heard a key grate in a lock, and Karamaneh drew me into the shadow of an open door, entered, and closed it behind her. For the first time I perceived, in contrast to the odors of the court without, the fragrance of the peculiar perfume which now I had come to associate with her. Absolute darkness was about us, and by this perfume alone I knew that she was near to me, until her hand touched mine, and I was led along an uncarpeted passage and up an uncarpeted stair. A second door was unlocked, and I found myself in an exquisitely furnished room, illuminated by the soft light of a shaded lamp which stood upon a low inlaid table, amidst a perfect ocean of silken cushions, strewn upon a Persian carpet, whose yellow richness was lost in the shadows beyond the circle of light. Karamaneh raised a curtain draped before a doorway and stood listening intently for a moment. The silence was unbroken. Then something stirred amid the wilderness of cushions, and two tiny bright eyes looked up at me. Peering closely, I succeeded in distinguishing, crouched in that soft luxuriance, a little ape. It was Dr. Fu-Manchu's marmoset. "This way," whispered Karamaneh. Never, I thought, was a staid medical man committed to a more unwise enterprise, but so far I had gone, and no consideration of prudence could now be of avail. The corridor beyond was thickly carpeted. Following the direction of a faint light which gleamed ahead, it proved to extend as a balcony across one end of a spacious apartment. Together we stood high up there in the shadows, and looked down upon such a scene as I never could have imagined to exist within many a mile of that district. The place below was even more richly appointed than the room into which first we had come. Here, as there, piles of cushions formed splashes of gaudy color about the floor. 3 lamps hung by chains from the ceiling, their light softened by rich silk shades. One wall was almost entirely occupied by glass cases containing chemical apparatus, tubes, retorts, and other less orthodox indications of Dr. Fu-Manchu's pursuits, whilst close against another lay the most extraordinary object of a sufficiently extraordinary room, a low couch, upon which was extended the motionless form of a boy. In the light of a lamp which hung directly above him, his olive face showed an almost startling resemblance to that of Karamaneh, save that the girl's coloring was more delicate. He had black, curly hair, which stood out prominently against the white covering upon which he lay, his hands crossed upon his breast. Transfixed with astonishment, I stood looking down upon him. The wonders of the Arabian Nights were wonders no longer, for here, in East End London, was a true magician's palace, lacking not its beautiful slave, lacking not its enchanted prince. "It is Aziz, my brother," said Karamaneh. We passed down a stairway onto the floor of the apartment. Karamaneh knelt and bent over the boy, stroking his hair and whispering to him lovingly. I too bent over him, and I shall never forget the anxiety in the girl's eyes as she watched me eagerly whilst I made a brief examination. Brief indeed, for even ere I had touched him, I knew that the comely shell held no spark of life. But Karamaneh fondled the cold hands and spoke softly in that Arabic tongue, which long before I had divined must be her native language. Then, as I remained silent, she turned and looked at me, read the truth in my eyes, and rose from her knees, stood rigidly upright, and clutched me tremblingly. "He is not dead. He is not dead," she whispered, and shook me as a child might, seeking to arouse me to a proper understanding. "Oh, tell me he is not." "I cannot," I replied gently, "for indeed he is." "No," she said, wild-eyed, and raising her hands to her face as though half distraught. "You do not understand. Yet you are a doctor. You do not understand." She stopped, moaning to herself and looking from the handsome face of the boy to me. It was pitiful. It was uncanny, but sorrow for the girl predominated in my mind. Then from somewhere I heard a sound which I had heard before in houses occupied by Dr. Fu-Manchu, that of a muffled gong. "Quick!" Karamaneh had me by the arm.
Up! He has returned! She fled up the stairs to the balcony. I closed at her heels.
The shadows veiled us. The thick carpet deadened the sound of our tread. Or certainly we must have been detected by the man who entered the room we had just quitted. It was Dr. Fu-Manchu, yellow-robed, immobile, the inhuman green eyes glittering cat-like even, it seemed, before the light struck them. He threaded his way through the archipelago of cushions and bent over the couch of Aziz. Karamaneh dragged me down onto my knees. "Watch," she whispered. "Watch." Dr. Fu-Manchu felt for the pulse of the boy whom a moment since I had pronounced dead, and stepping to the tall glass case, took out a long-necked flask of chased gold, and from it, into a graduated glass, he poured some drops of an amber liquid wholly unfamiliar to me. I watched him with all my eyes, and noted how high the liquid rose in the measure. He charged a needle syringe, and bending again over Aziz, made an injection. Then all the wonders I had heard of this man became possible, and with an awe which any other physician who had examined Aziz must have felt, I admitted him a miracle worker. For as I watched, all but breathless, the dead came to life. The glow of health crept upon the olive cheek. The boy moved. He raised his hands above his head. He sat up, supported by the Chinese doctor. Fu-Manchu touched some hidden bell. A hideous yellow man with a scarred face entered, carrying a tray upon which were a bowl containing some steaming fluid, apparently soup, what looked like oaten cakes, and a flask of red wine. As the boy, exhibiting no more unusual symptoms than if he had just awakened from a normal sleep, commenced his repast, Karamaneh drew me gently along the passage into the room which we had first entered. My heart leaped wildly as the marmoset bounded past us to drop hand over hand to the lower apartment in search of its master. "You see," said Karamaneh, her voice quivering, "he is not dead, but without Fu-Manchu he is dead to me. How can I leave him when he holds the life of Aziz in his hand?" "You must get me that flask or some of its contents," I directed. "But tell me, how does he produce the appearance of death?" "I cannot tell you," she replied. "I do not know. It is something in the wine. In another hour, Aziz will be again as you saw him. But see." And opening a little ebony box, she produced a phial half filled with the amber liquid. "Good," I said and slipped it into my pocket. "When will be the best time to seize Fu-Manchu and to restore your brother?" "I will let you know," she whispered, and opening the door, pushed me hurriedly from the room. "He is going away tonight to the north, but you must not come tonight. Quick, quick, along the passage. He may call me at any moment." So, with the phial in my pocket containing a potent preparation unknown to Western science, and with a last long look into the eyes of Karamaneh, I passed out into the narrow alley, out from the fragrant perfumes of that mystery house into the place of Thames-side stenches. "We must arrange for the house to be raided without delay," said Smith. "This time we are sure of our ally." "But we must keep our promise to her," I interrupted. "You can look after that, Petrie," my friend said. "I will devote the whole of my attention to Dr. Fu-Manchu," he added grimly. Up and down the room he paced, gripping the blackened briar between his teeth, so that the muscles stood out squarely upon his lean jaws. The bronze which spoke of the Burmese sun enhanced the brightness of his gray eyes. "What have I all along maintained?" He jerked, looking back at me across his shoulder. "That although Karamaneh was one of the strongest weapons in the doctor's armory, she was one which someday would be turned against him. That day has dawned. We must await word from her." "Quite so." He knocked out his pipe on the grate. Then, "Have you any idea of the nature of the fluid in the phial?" "Not the slightest, and I have none to spare for analytical purposes." Nayland Smith began stuffing mixture into the hot pipe bowl and dropping an almost equal quantity on the floor. "I cannot rest, Petrie," he said. "I am itching to get to work. Yet, a false move, and—" He lighted his pipe and stood staring from the window. "I shall, of course, take a needle syringe with me," I explained. Smith made no reply. "If I but knew the composition of the drug which produced the semblance of death," I continued, "my fame would long survive my ashes." My friend did not turn. "But, she said it was something he put in the wine?" he jerked. "In the wine, yes." Silence fell. My thoughts reverted to Karamaneh, whom Dr. Fu-Manchu held in bonds stronger than any slave chains. For with Aziz, her brother, suspended between life and death, what could she do save obey the mandates of the cunning Chinaman? What perverted genius was his? If that treasury of obscure wisdom which he, perhaps alone of living men, had rifled, could but be thrown open to the sick and suffering, the name of Dr. Fu-Manchu would rank with the golden ones in the history of healing.
Nayland Smith suddenly turned, and the expression upon his face amazed me. "Look up the next train to L," he rapped. "To L? What?" "There's the Bradshaw. We haven't a minute to waste." In his voice was the imperative note I knew so well. In his eyes was the light which told of an urgent need for action, a portentous truth suddenly grasped. 1.5 an hour, the last. We must catch it. No further word of explanation he vouchsafed, but darted off to dress, for he had spent the afternoon pacing the room in his dressing gown and smoking without intermission. Out into the corner we hurried, and leaped into the first taxi upon the rank. Smith enjoined the man to hasten, and we were off, all in that whirl of feverish activity which characterized my friend's movements in times of important action. He sat glancing impatiently from the window and twitching at the lobe of his ear. "I know you will forgive me, old man," he said, "but there is a little problem which I am trying to work out in my mind. Did you bring the things I mentioned?" "Yes." Conversation lapsed, until just as the cab turned into the station, Smith said, "Should you consider Lord Southery to have been the first constructive engineer of his time, Petrie?" "Undoubtedly," I replied. "Greater than von Homber of Berlin?" "Possibly not, but von Homber has been dead for 3 years. 3 years, is it?" "Roughly." "Ah." We reached the station in time to secure a non-corridor compartment to ourselves and to allow Smith leisure carefully to inspect the occupants of all the others, from the engine to the guard's van. He was muffled up to the eyes, and he warned me to keep out of sight in the corner of the compartment. In fact, his behavior had me bursting with curiosity, the train having started. "Don't imagine, Petrie," said Smith, "that I'm trying to lead you blindfolded in order later to dazzle you with my perspicacity. I'm simply afraid that this may be a wild goose chase. The idea upon which I am acting does not seem to have struck you. I wish it had. The fact would argue in favor of its being sound. At present, I am hopelessly mystified. Well then, I will not bias you towards my view, but just study the situation and see if you can arrive at the reason for this sudden journey. I shall be distinctly encouraged if you succeed." But I did not succeed, and since Smith obviously was unwilling to enlighten me, I pressed him no more. The train stopped at Rugby, where he was engaged with the station master in making some mysterious arrangements. At L, however, their object became plain, for a high-power car was awaiting us, and into this we hurried, and ere the greater number of passengers had reached the platform were being driven off at headlong speed along the moon-bathed roads. 20 minutes rapid traveling, and a white mansion leaped into the line of sight, standing out vividly against its woody backing. "Stradwick Hall," said Smith. "The home of Lord Southery. We are first, but Dr. Fu-Manchu is on the train." Then the truth dawned upon the gloom of my perplexity. "Your extraordinary proposal fills me with horror, Mr. Smith." The sleek little man in the dress suit, who looked like a head waiter, but was the trusted legal advisor of the House of Southery, puffed at his cigar indignantly. Nayland Smith, whose restless pacing had led him to the far end of the library, turned, a remote but virile figure, and looked back to where I stood by the open hearth with the solicitor. "I am in your hands, Mr. Henderson," he said, and advanced upon the ladder, his gray eyes ablaze. "Save for the heir, who is abroad on foreign service, you say there is no kin of Lord Southery to consider. The word rests with you. If I am wrong, and you agree to my proposal, there is none whose susceptibilities will suffer. My own, sir! If I am right, and you prevent me from acting, you become a murderer, Mr. Henderson." The lawyer started, staring nervously up at Smith, who now towered over him menacingly. "Lord Southery was a lonely man," continued my friend. "If I could have placed my proposition before one of his blood, I do not doubt what my answer had been. Why do you hesitate? Why do you experience this feeling of horror?" Mr. Henderson stared down into the fire. His constitutionally ruddy face was pale. "It is entirely irregular, Mr. Smith. We have not the necessary powers." Smith snapped his teeth together impatiently, snatching his watch from his pocket and glancing at it. "I am vested with the necessary powers. I will give you a written order, sir. The proceeding savors of paganism. Such a course might be admissible in China, in Burma."
Do you weigh a life against such quibbles? Do you suppose that granting my irresponsibility, Dr. Petrie would countenance such a thing if he doubted the necessity? Mr. Henderson looked at me with pathetic hesitance.
There are guests in the house, mourners who attended the ceremony today. They will never know if we are in error, interrupted Smith. Good God. Why do you delay? You wish it to be kept secret? You and I, Mr. Henderson, and Dr. Petrie will go now. We require no other witnesses. We are answerable only to our consciences. The lawyer passed his hand across his damp brow. I have never in my life been called upon to come to so momentous a decision in so short a time, he confessed. But, aided by Smith's indomitable will, he made his decision. As its result, we three, looking and feeling like conspirators, hurried across the park beneath a moon whose placidity was a rebuke to the turbulent passions which reared their strangle growth in the Garden of England. Not a breath of wind stirred amid the leaves. The calm of perfect night soothed everything to slumber. Yet if Smith were right, and I did not doubt him, the green eyes of Dr. Fu-Manchu had looked upon the scene, and I found myself marveling that its beauty had not wilted up. Even now the dread Chinaman must be near to us. As Mr. Henderson unlocked the ancient iron gates, he turned to Nayland Smith. His face twitched oddly. Witness that I do this unwillingly, he said, most unwillingly. Mine be the responsibility, was the reply. Smith's voice quivered, responsive to the nervous vitality pent up within that lean frame. He stood motionless listening, and I knew for whom he listened. He peered about him to right and left, and I knew whom he expected but dreaded to see. Above us now the trees looked down with a solemnity different from the aspect of the monarchs of the park, and the nearer we came to our journey's end, the more somber and lowering bent the verdant arch, or so it seemed. By that path, patched now with pools of moonlight, Lord Southery had passed upon his bier, with the sun to light his going. By that path, several generations of Stradwicks had gone to their last resting place. To the doors of the vault, the moon rays found free access. No branch, no leaf intervened. Mr. Henderson's face looked ghastly. The keys which he carried rattled in his hand. Light the lantern, he said unsteadily. Nayland Smith, who again had been peering suspiciously about into the shadows, struck a match and lighted the lantern which he carried. He turned to the solicitor. Be calm, Mr. Henderson, he said sternly. It is your plain duty to your client. God be my witness that I doubt it, replied Henderson, and opened the door. We descended the steps. The air beneath was damp and chill. It touched us as with clammy fingers, and the sensation was not wholly physical. Before the narrow mansion which now sufficed Lord Southery, the great engineer whom kings had honored, Henderson reeled and clutched at me for support. Smith and I had looked to him for no aid in our uncanny task, and rightly. With averted eyes he stood over by the steps of the tomb, whilst my friend and myself set to work. In the pursuit of my profession I had undertaken labors as unpleasant, but never amid an environment such as this. It seemed that generations of Stradwicks listened to each turn of every screw. At last it was done, and the pallid face of Lord Southery questioned the intruding light. Nayland Smith's hand was as steady as a rigid bar when he raised the lantern. Later, I knew, there would be a sudden releasing of the tension of will, a reaction physical and mental, but not until his work was finished. That my own hand was steady I ascribed to one thing solely, professional zeal. For, under conditions which, in the event of failure and exposure, must have led to an unpleasant inquiry by the British Medical Association, I was about to attempt an experiment never before essayed by a physician of the white races. Though I failed, though I succeeded, that it ever came before the BMA or any other council was improbable. In the former event, all but impossible. But the knowledge that I was about to practice charlatanry, or what any one of my fellow practitioners must have designated as such, was with me. Yet so profound had my belief become in the extraordinary being whose existence was a danger to the world that I reveled in my immunity from official censure. I was glad that it had fallen to my lot to take at least one step, though blindly, into the future of medical science. So far as my skill bore me, Lord Southery was dead. Unhesitatingly, I would have given a death certificate, save for two considerations. The first, although his latest scheme ran contrary from the interests of Dr. Fu-Manchu, his genius, diverted into other channels, would serve the Yellow Group better than his death. The second, I had seen the boy Aziz raised from a state as like death as this. From the phial of amber-hued liquid which I had with me, I charged the needle syringe. I made the injection and waited. If he is really dead, whispered Smith, It seems incredible that he can have survived for 3 days without food, yet I have known a fakir to go for a week." Mr. Henderson groaned. Watch in hand, I stood observing the gray face. A second passed, another, a third. In the fourth, the miracle began. Over the seemingly cold clay crept the hue of pulsing life. It came in waves which corresponded with the throbbing of the awakened heart, which swept fuller and stronger, which filled and quickened the chilled body. As we rapidly freed the living man from the trappings of the dead one, Sothery, uttering a stifled scream, sat up, looked about him with half-glazed eyes, and fell back. "My God," cried Smith. "It is all right," I said, and had time to note how my voice had assumed a professional tone. "A little brandy from my flask is all that is necessary now." "You have 2 patients, Doctor," rapped my friend. Mr. Henderson had fallen in a swoon to the floor of the vault. "Quiet," whispered Smith. "He is here." He extinguished the light. I supported Lord Sothery. "What has happened?" he kept moaning. "Where am I? Oh God, what has happened?" I strove to reassure him in a whisper and placed my traveling coat about him. The door at the top of the mausoleum steps we had reclosed, but not relocked. Now as I upheld the man whom literally we had rescued from the grave, I heard the door reopen. To aid Henderson, I could make no move. Smith was breathing hard beside me. I dared not think what was about to happen, nor what its effects might be upon Lord Sothery in his exhausted condition. Through the Memphian dark of the tomb cut a spear of light, touching the last stone of the stairway. A guttural voice spoke some words rapidly, and I knew that Dr. Fu-Manchu stood at the head of the stairs. Although I could not see my friend, I became aware that Nayland Smith had his revolver in his hand, and I reached into my pocket for mine. At last, the cunning Chinaman was about to fall into a trap. It would require all his genius, I thought, to save him tonight. Unless his suspicions were aroused by the unlocked door, his capture was imminent. Someone was descending the steps. In my right hand, I held my revolver, and with my left arm about Lord Sothery, I waited through 10 such seconds of suspense as I have rarely known. The spear of light plunged into the well of darkness again. Lord Sothery, Smith, and myself were hidden by the angle of the wall, but full upon the purplish face of Mr. Henderson the beam shone. In some way it penetrated to the murk in his mind, and he awakened from his swoon with a hoarse cry, struggled to his feet, and stood looking up the stair in a sort of frozen horror. Smith was past him at a bound. Something flashed towards him as the light was extinguished. I saw him duck and heard the knife ring upon the floor. I managed to move sufficiently to see at the top, as I fired up the stairs, the yellow face of Dr. Fu-Manchu, to see the gleaming, chatoyant eyes, greenly terrible, as they sought to pierce the gloom. A flying figure was racing up 3 steps at a time, that of a brown man scantily clad. He stumbled and fell, by which I knew that he was hit, but went on again, Smith hard on his heels. "Mr. Henderson," I cried, "relight the lantern and take charge of Lord Sothery. Here is my flask on the floor. I rely upon you." Smith's revolver spoke again as I went bounding up the stair. Black against the square of moonlight, I saw him stagger. I saw him fall. As he fell for the 3rd time, I heard the crack of his revolver. Instantly, I was at his side. Somewhere along the black aisle beneath the trees, receding footsteps pattered. "Are you hurt, Smith?" I cried anxiously. He got upon his feet. "He has a dacoit with him," he replied, and showed me the long curved knife which he held in his hand, a full inch of the blade blood-stained. "A near thing for me, Petrie." I heard the whir of a restarted motor. "We have lost him," said Smith. "But we have saved Lord Sothery," I said. "Fu-Manchu will credit us with a skill as great as his own." "We must get to the car," Smith muttered, "and try to overtake them. Ugh, my left arm is useless." "It would be mere waste of time to attempt to overtake them," I argued, "for we have no idea in which direction they will proceed." "I have a very good idea," snapped Smith. "Stradwick Hall is less than 10 miles from the coast. There is only one practicable means of conveying an unconscious man secretly from here to London." "You think he meant to take him from here to London?" "Prior to shipping him to China. I think so. His clearinghouse is probably on the Thames." "A boat?" "A yacht, presumably, is lying off the coast in readiness. Fu-Manchu may even have designed to ship him direct to China." Lord Sothery, a bizarre figure, my traveling coat wrapped about him, and supported by his solicitor, who was almost as pale as himself, emerged from the vault into the moonlight. "This is a triumph for you, Smith," I said. The throb of Fu-Manchu's car died into faintness and was lost in the night silence. Only half a triumph, he replied. But we still have another chance, the raid on his house. When will the word come from Karamaneh? Sothery spoke in a weak voice. Gentlemen, he said, it seems I am raised from the dead. It was the weirdest moment of the night wherein we heard that newly buried man speak from the mold of his tomb. Yes, replied Smith slowly, and spared from the fate of heaven alone knows how many men of genius. The Yellow Society lacks a Sothery, but that Dr. Fu-Manchu was in Germany 3 years ago, I have reason to believe. So that, even without visiting the grave of your great Teutonic rival, who suddenly died at about that time, I venture to predict that they have a von Homber, and the futurist group in China knows how to make men work. From the rescue of Lord Sothery, my story bears me mercilessly on to other things. I may not tarry as more leisurely penman to round my incidents, they were not of my choosing. I may not pause to make you better acquainted with the figure of my drama, its scheme is none of mine. Often enough in those days, I found a fitness in the lines of Omar. We are no other than a moving show of magic shadow shapes that come and go, round with the sun-illumined lantern held in midnight by the master of the show. But the master of the show, in this case, was Dr. Fu-Manchu. I have been asked many times since the days with which these records deal, who was Dr. Fu-Manchu? Let me confess here that my final answer must be postponed. I can only indicate, at this place, the trend of my reasoning, and leave my reader to form whatever conclusion he pleases. What group can we isolate and label as responsible for the overthrow of the Manchus? The casual student of modern Chinese history will reply, Young China. This is unsatisfactory. What do we mean by Young China? In my own hearing, Fu-Manchu had disclaimed, with scorn, association with the whole of that movement, and assuming that the name were not an assumed one, he clearly can have been no anti-Manchu, no Republican. The Chinese Republican is of the Mandarin class, but of a new generation which veneers its Confucianism with Western Polish. These youthful and unbalanced reformers, in conjunction with older but no less ill-balanced provincial politicians, may be said to represent Young China. Amid such turmoils as this, we invariably look for, and invariably find, a third party. In my opinion, Dr. Fu-Manchu was one of the leaders of such a party. Another question often put to me was, where did the doctor hide during the time that he pursued his operations in London? This is more susceptible of explanation. For a time, Nayland Smith supposed, as I did myself, that the opium den adjacent to the old Ratcliffe Highway was the Chinaman's base of operations. Later, we came to believe that the mansion near Windsor was his hiding place, and later still, the hulk lying off the downstream flats. But I think I can state with confidence that the spot which he had chosen for his home was neither of these, but the East End Riverside building which I was the first to enter. Of this I am all but sure, for the reason that it not only was the home of Fu-Manchu, of Karamaneh, and of her brother Aziz, but the home of something else, of something which I shall speak of later. The dreadful tragedy, or series of tragedies, which attended the raid upon the place, will always mark in my memory the supreme horror of a horrible case. Let me endeavor to explain what occurred. By the aid of Karamaneh, you have seen how we had located the Wheelham warehouse, which from the exterior was so drab and dreary, but which within was a place of wondrous luxury. At the moment selected by our beautiful accomplice, Inspector Weymouth and a body of detectives entirely surrounded it. A river police launch lay off the wharf which opened from it on the riverside, and this upon a singularly black night than which a better could not have been chosen. You will fulfill your promise to me? Said Karamaneh, and looked up into my face. She was enveloped in a big, loose cloak, and from the shadow of the hood her wonderful eyes gleamed out like stars. What do you wish us to do? Asked Nayland Smith. You and Dr. Petrie, she replied swiftly, must enter first and bring out Aziz. Until he is safe, until he is out of that place, you are to make no attempt upon Dr. Fu-Manchu? Interrupted Weymouth, for Karamaneh hesitated to pronounce the dreaded name, as she always did. But how can we be sure that there is no trap laid for us? The Scotland Yard man did not entirely share my confidence in the integrity of this Eastern girl, whom he knew to have been a creature of the Chinaman's. Aziz lies in the private room, she explained eagerly, her old accent more noticeable than usual. There is only one of the Burmese men in the house, and he dare not enter without orders. But Fu-Manchu? We have nothing to fear from him. He will be your prisoner within 10 minutes from now. I have no time for words. You must believe. She stamped her foot impatiently. And the dacoit? Snapped Smith. He also, "I think perhaps I'd better come in too," said Weymouth slowly.
Karamaneh shrugged her shoulders with quick impatience and unlocked the door in the high brick wall which divided the gloomy, evil-smelling court from the luxurious apartments of Dr. Fu-Manchu.
"Make no noise," she warned.
And Smith and myself followed her along the uncarpeted passage beyond. Inspector Weymouth, with a final word of instruction to his second-in-command, brought up the rear. The door was reclosed. A few paces farther on, a second was unlocked. Passing through a small room, unfurnished, a farther passage led us to a balcony. The transition was startling.
Darkness was about us now, and silence. A perfumed, slumberous darkness, a silence full of mystery. For, beyond the walls of the apartment whereon we looked down, waged the unceasing battle of sounds that is the hymn of the great industrial river. About the scented confines which bounded us, now floated the smoke-laden vapors of the lower Thames. From the metallic but infinitely human clangor of dockside life, from the unpleasant but homely odors which prevail where ships swallow in and belch out the concrete evidences of commercial prosperity, we had come into this incensed stillness, where one shaded lamp painted dim enlargements of its Chinese silk upon the nearer walls, and left the greater part of the room the darker for its contrast. Nothing of the Thames-side activity, of the riveting and scraping, the bumping of bales, the bawling of orders, the hiss of steam, penetrated to this perfumed place. In the pool of tinted light lay the death-like figure of a dark-haired boy, Karamaneh's muffled form bending over him. "At last I stand in the house of Dr. Fu-Manchu," whispered Smith.
Despite the girl's assurance, we knew that proximity to the sinister Chinaman must be fraught with danger. We stood not in the lion's den, but in the serpent's lair. From the time when Nayland Smith had come from Burma in pursuit of this advance guard of a cogent yellow peril, the face of Dr. Fu-Manchu rarely had been absent from my dreams day or night. The millions might sleep in peace, the millions in whose cause we labored. But we who knew the reality of the danger knew that a veritable octopus had fastened upon England. A yellow octopus whose head was that of Dr. Fu-Manchu, whose tentacles were dacoity, thuggy, modes of death, secret and swift, which in the darkness plucked men from life and left no clue behind. "Karamaneh," I called softly. The muffled form beneath the lamp turned so that the soft light fell upon the lovely face of the slave girl. She who had been a pliant instrument in the hands of Fu-Manchu now was to be the means whereby society should be rid of him. She raised her finger warningly, then beckoned me to approach. My feet sinking in the rich pile of the carpet, I came through the gloom of the great apartment into the patch of light, and Karamaneh beside me stood looking down upon the boy. It was Aziz, her brother, dead so far as Western lore had power to judge, but kept alive in that death-like trance by the uncanny power of the Chinese doctor. "Be quick," she said, "be quick, awaken him. I am afraid." From the case which I carried, I took out a needle syringe and a phial containing a small quantity of amber-hued liquid. It was a drug not to be found in the British pharmacopoeia. Of its constitution I knew nothing. Although I had had the phial in my possession for some days, I had not dared to devote any of its precious contents to analytical purposes. The amber drop spelled life for the boy Aziz, spelled success for the mission of Nayland Smith, spelled ruin for the fiendish Chinaman. I raised the white coverlet. The boy, fully dressed, lay with his arms crossed upon his breast. I discerned the mark of previous injections as, charging the syringe from the phial, I made what I hoped would be the last of such experiments upon him. I would have given half of my small worldly possessions to have known the real nature of the drug, which was now coursing through the veins of Aziz, which was tinting the grayed face with the olive tone of life, which, so far as my medical training bore me, was restoring the dead to life. But such was not the purpose of my visit. I was come to remove from the house of Dr. Fu-Manchu the living chain which bound Karamaneh to him. The boy alive and free, the doctor's hold upon the slave girl would be broken. My lovely companion, her hands convulsively clasped, knelt and devoured with her eyes the face of the boy who was passing through the most amazing physiological change in the history of therapeutics. The peculiar perfume which she wore, which seemed to be a part of her, which always I associated with her, was faintly perceptible. Karamaneh was breathing rapidly. "You have nothing to fear," I whispered. "See, he is reviving. In a few moments all will be well with him." The hanging lamp with its garishly colored shade swung gently above us, wafted, it seemed, by some draught which passed through the apartment. The boy's heavy lids began to quiver, and Karamaneh nervously clutched my arm and held me so whilst we watched for the long-lashed eyes to open. The stillness of the place was positively unnatural. It seemed inconceivable that all about us was the discordant activity of the commercial East End. Indeed, this eerie silence was becoming oppressive. It began positively to appall me. Inspector Weymouth's wondering face peeped over my shoulder. "Where is Dr. Fu-Manchu?" I whispered, as Nayland Smith in turn appeared beside me. "I cannot understand the silence of the house." "Look about," replied Karamaneh, never taking her eyes from the face of Aziz. I peered around the shadowy walls. Tall glass cases there were, shelves and niches, where once from the gallery above I had seen the tubes and retorts, the jars of unfamiliar organisms, the books of unfamiliar lore, the impedimenta of the occult student and man of science, the visible evidences of Fu-Manchu's presence. Shelves, cases, niches were bare. Of the complicated appliances unknown to civilized laboratories, wherewith he pursued his strange experiments, of the tubes wherein he isolated the bacilli of unclassified diseases, of the yellow-bound volumes for a glimpse at which, had they known of their contents, the great men of Harley Street would have given a fortune. No trace remained. The silken cushions, the inlaid tables, all were gone. The room was stripped, dismantled. Had Fu-Manchu fled? The silence assumed a new significance. His dacoits and kindred ministers of death all must have fled too. "You have let him escape us," I said rapidly. "You promised to aid us to capture him, to send us a message, and you have delayed until—" "No," she said, "no," and clutched at my arm again. "Oh, is he not reviving slowly? Are you sure you have made no mistake?" Her thoughts were all for the boy, and her solicitude touched me. I again examined Aziz, the most remarkable patient of my busy professional career. As I counted the strengthening pulse, he opened his dark eyes, which were so like the eyes of Karamaneh, and with the girl's eager arms tightly about him, sat up, looking wonderingly around. Karamaneh pressed her cheek to his, whispering loving words in that softly spoken Arabic which had first betrayed her nationality to Nayland Smith. I handed her my flask, which I had filled with wine. "My promise is fulfilled," I said. "You are free. Now for Fu-Manchu. But first let us admit the police to this house. There is something uncanny in its stillness." "No," she replied. "First let my brother be taken out and placed in safety. Will you carry him?" She raised her face to that of Inspector Weymouth, upon which was written awe and wonder. The burly detective lifted the boy as tenderly as a woman, passed through the shadows to the stairway, ascended, and was swallowed up in the gloom. Nayland Smith's eyes gleamed feverishly. He turned to Karamaneh. "You are not playing with us?" he said harshly. "We have done our part. It remains for you to do yours." "Do not speak so loudly," the girl begged. "He is near us, and oh God, I fear him so." "Where is he?" persisted my friend. Karamaneh's eyes were glassy with fear now. "You must not touch him until the police are here," she said, but from the direction of her quick, agitated glances I knew that, her brother safe now, she feared for me, and for me alone. Those glances sent my blood dancing, for Karamaneh was an Eastern jewel which any man of flesh and blood must have coveted had he known it to lie within his reach. Her eyes were twin lakes of mystery which more than once I had known the desire to explore. "Look, beyond that curtain," her voice was barely audible, "but do not enter. Even as he is, I fear him." Her voice, her palpable agitation, prepared us for something extraordinary. Tragedy and Fu-Manchu were never far apart. Though we were two, and help was so near, we were in the abode of the most cunning murderer who ever came out of the East. It was with strangely mingled emotions that I crossed the thick carpet, Nayland Smith beside me, and drew aside the draperies concealing a door, to which Karamaneh had pointed. Then, upon looking into the dim place beyond, all else save what it held was forgotten. We looked upon a small square room, the walls draped with fantastic Chinese tapestry, the floor strewn with cushions, and reclining in a corner, where the faint blue light from a lamp placed upon a low table painted grotesque shadows about the cavernous face, was Dr. Fu-Manchu. At sight of him my heart leaped and seemed to suspend its functions, so intense was the horror which this man's presence inspired in me. My hand clutching the curtain, I stood watching him. The lids veiled the malignant green eyes, but the thin lips seemed to smile. Then Smith silently pointed to the hand which held a little pipe. A sickly perfume assailed my nostrils, and the explanation of the hushed silence and the ease with which we had thus far executed our plan came to me. The cunning mind was torpid, lost in a brutish world of dreams. Fu-Manchu was in an opium sleep. The dim light traced out a network of tiny lines, which covered the yellow face from the pointed chin to the top of the great domed brow, and formed deep shadow pools in the hollows beneath his eyes. At last we had triumphed. I could not determine the depth of his obscene trance, and mastering some of my repugnance, and forgetful of Karamaneh's warning, I was about to step forward into the room, loaded with its nauseating opium fumes, when a soft breath fanned my cheek. "Do not go in," came Karamaneh's warning voice, hushed, trembling. Her little hand grasped my arm. She drew Smith and myself back from the door. "There is danger there," she whispered. "Do not enter that room. The police must reach him in some way and drag him out. Do not enter that room." The girl's voice quivered hysterically. Her eyes blazed into savage flame. The fierce resentment born of dreadful wrongs was consuming her now, but fear of Fu-Manchu held her yet. Inspector Weymouth came down the stairs and joined us. "I have sent the boy to Ryman's room at the station," he said. "The divisional surgeon will look after him until you arrive, Dr. Petrie. All is ready now. The launch is just off the wharf and every side of the place under observation. Where's our man?" He drew a pair of handcuffs from his pocket and raised his eyebrows interrogatively. The absence of sound, of any demonstration from the uncanny Chinaman whom he was there to arrest, puzzled him. Nayland Smith jerked his thumb toward the curtain. At that, and before we could utter a word, Weymouth stepped to the draped door. He was a man who drove straight at his goal and saved reflections for subsequent leisure. I think, moreover, that the atmosphere of the place, stripped as it was, it retained its heavy, voluptuous perfume, had begun to get a hold upon him. He was anxious to shake it off, to be up and doing. He pulled the curtain aside and stepped into the room. Smith and I perforce followed him. Just within the door, the three of us stood looking across at the limp thing, which had spread terror throughout the eastern and western world. Helpless as Fu-Manchu was, he inspired terror now, though the giant intellect was inert, stupefied. In the dimly lit apartment we had quitted, I heard Karamaneh utter a stifled scream, but it came too late. As though cast up by a volcano, the silken cushions, the inlaid table with its blue-shaded lamp, the garish walls, the sprawling figure with the ghastly light playing upon its features, quivered and shot upward, so it seemed to me. Though in the ensuing instant I remembered too late a previous experience of the floors of Fu-Manchu's private apartments. I knew what had indeed befallen us. A trap had been released beneath our feet. I recall falling, but have no recollection of the end of my fall, of the shock marking the drop. I only remember fighting for my life against a stifling something which had me by the throat. I knew that I was being suffocated, but my hands met only the deathly emptiness. Into a poisonous well of darkness I sank. I could not cry out. I was helpless. Of the fate of my companions I knew nothing, could surmise nothing. Then, all consciousness ended. I was being carried along a dimly lighted tunnel-like place, slung, sackwise, across the shoulder of a Burman. He was not a big man, but he supported my considerable weight with apparent ease. A deadly nausea held me, but the rough handling had served to restore me to consciousness. My hands and feet were closely lashed. I hung limply as a wet towel. I felt that this spark of tortured life which had flickered up in me must ere long finally become extinguished. A fancy possessed me, in these the first moments of my restoration to the world of realities, that I had been smuggled into China. And as I swung head downward, I told myself that the huge, puffy things which strewed the path were a species of giant toadstool, unfamiliar to me and possibly peculiar to whatever district of China I now was in. The air was hot, steamy, and loaded with a smell as of rotting vegetation. I wondered why my bearer so scrupulously avoided touching any of the unwholesome-looking growths in passing through what seemed a succession of cellars, but steered a tortuous course among the bloated, unnatural shapes, lifting his bare brown feet with a cat-like delicacy. He passed under a low arch, dropped me roughly to the ground, and ran back. Half stunned, I lay watching the agile brown body melt into the distances of the cellars. Their walls and roof seemed to emit a faint, phosphorescent light. "Petrie," came a weak voice from somewhere ahead. "Is that you, Petrie? It was Nayland Smith." "Smith," I said, and strove to sit up, but the intense nausea overcame me so that I all but swooned. I heard his voice again, but could attach no meaning to the words which he uttered. A sound of terrific blows reached my ears too. The Burman reappeared, bending under the heavy load which he bore. For, as he picked his way through the bloated things which grew upon the floors of the cellars, I realized that he was carrying the inert body of Inspector Weymouth, and I found time to compare the strength of the little brown man with that of a Nile beetle, which can raise many times its own weight. Then, behind him, appeared a second figure, which immediately claimed the whole of my errant attention. "Fu-Manchu," hissed my friend, from the darkness which concealed him. It was indeed none other than Fu-Manchu, the Fu-Manchu whom we had thought to be helpless. The deeps of the Chinaman's cunning, the fine quality of his courage, were forced upon me as amazing facts. He had assumed the appearance of a drugged opium smoker so well as to dupe me, a medical man, so well as to dupe Karamaneh, whose experience of the noxious habit probably was greater than my own. And with the gallows dangling before him, he had waited, played the part of a lure, whilst a body of police actually surrounded the place. I have since thought that the room probably was one which he actually used for opium debauches, and the device of the trap was intended to protect him during the comatose period. Now, holding a lantern above his head, the deviser of the trap whereinto we, mouse-like, had blindly entered, came through the cellars, following the brown man who carried Weymouth. The faint rays of the lantern, it apparently contained a candle, revealed a veritable forest of the gigantic fungi, poisonously colored, hideously swollen, climbing from the floor up the slimy walls, climbing like horrid parasites to such part of the arched roof as was visible to me. Fu-Manchu picked his way through the fungi ranks as daintily as though the distorted, tumid things had been viper-headed. The resounding blows which I had noted before, and which had never ceased, culminated in a splintering crash. Dr. Fu-Manchu and his servant, who carried the apparently insensible detective, passed in under the arch, Fu-Manchu glancing back once along the passages. The lantern he extinguished or concealed, and whilst I waited, my mind dully surveying memories of all the threats which this uncanny being had uttered, a distant clamor came to my ears. Then abruptly it ceased. Dr. Fu-Manchu had closed a heavy door, and to my surprise I perceived that the greater part of it was of glass. The will-o'-the-wisp glow which played around the fungi rendered the vista of the cellars faintly luminous and visible to me from where I lay. Fu-Manchu spoke softly. His voice, its guttural note alternating with a sibilance on certain words, betrayed no traces of agitation. The man's unbroken calm had in it something inhuman, for he had just perpetrated an act of daring unparalleled in my experience, and in the clamor now shut out by the glass door, I tardily recognized the entrance of the police into some barricaded part of the house, the coming of those who would save us, who would hold the Chinese doctor for the hangman. "I have decided," he said deliberately, "that you are more worthy of my attention than I had formerly supposed. A man who can solve the secret of the golden elixir, I had not solved it, I had merely stolen some, should be a valuable acquisition to my counsel. The extent of the plans of Mr. Commissioner Nayland Smith and of the English Scotland Yard it is incumbent upon me to learn. Therefore, gentlemen, you live for the present." "And you'll swing," came Weymouth's hoarse voice, "in the near future. You and all your yellow gang." "I trust not," was the placid reply. "Most of my people are safe. Some are shipped as lascars upon the liners. Others have departed by different means." Ah! That last word was the only one indicative of excitement which had yet escaped him. A disk of light danced among the brilliant poison hues of the passages, but no sound reached us, by which I knew that the glass door must fit almost hermetically. It was much cooler here than in the place through which we had passed, and the nausea began to leave me, my brain to grow more clear. Had I known what was to follow, I should have cursed the lucidity of mind which now came to me. I should have prayed for oblivion, to be spared the sight of that which ensued. "It's Logan!" cried Inspector Weymouth, and I could tell that he was struggling to free himself of his bonds. From his voice it was evident that he too was recovering from the effects of the narcotic which had been administered to us all. "Logan!" he cried. "Logan! This way! Help!" But the cry beat back upon us in that enclosed space and seemed to carry no farther than the invisible walls of our prison. "The door fits well," came Fu-Manchu's mocking voice. "It is fortunate for us all that it is so. This is my observation window, Dr. Petrie, and you are about to enjoy an unique opportunity of studying fungology. I have already drawn your attention to the anesthetic properties of the lycoperdon, or common puffball. You may have recognized the fumes. The chamber into which you rashly precipitated yourselves was charged with them. By a process of my own, I have greatly enhanced the value of the puffball in this respect. Your friend, Mr. Weymouth, proved the most obstinate subject, but he succumbed in 15 seconds. "Logan, help! Help! This way, man!" Something very like fear sounded in Weymouth's voice now.
Indeed, the situation was so uncanny that it almost seemed unreal. A group of men had entered the farthermost cellars, led by one who bore an electric pocket lamp. The hard white ray danced from bloated gray fungi to others of nightmare shape, of dazzling, venomous brilliance. The mocking lecture room voice continued. "Note the snowy growth upon the roof, Doctor. Do not be deceived by its size. It is a giant variety of my own culture, and is of the order Empusa. You in England are familiar with the death of the common housefly, which is found attached to the window pane by a coating of white mold. I have developed the spores of this mold and have produced a giant species. Observe the interesting effect of the strong light upon my orange and blue Amanita fungus." Hard beside me, I heard Nayland Smith groan. Weymouth had become suddenly silent. For my own part, I could have shrieked in pure horror, for I knew what was coming. I realized in one agonized instant the significance of the dim lantern, of the careful progress through the subterranean fungi grove, of the care with which Fu-Manchu and his servant had avoided touching any of the growths. I knew now that Dr. Fu-Manchu was the greatest fungologist the world had ever known, was a poisoner to whom the Borgias were as children, and I knew that the detectives blindly were walking into a valley of death. Then it began, the unnatural scene, the saturnalia of murder. Like so many bombs, the brilliantly colored caps of the huge toadstool-like things alluded to by the Chinaman exploded, as the white ray sought them out in the darkness which alone preserved their existence. A brownish cloud, I could not determine whether liquid or powdery, arose in the cellar. I tried to close my eyes, or to turn them away from the reeling forms of the men who were trapped in that poison hole. It was useless. I must look. The bearer of the lamp had dropped it, but the dim, eerily illuminated gloom endured scarce a second. A bright light sprang up, doubtless at the touch of the fiendish being who now resumed speech. "Observe the symptoms of delirium, Doctor." Out there, beyond the glass door, the unhappy victims were laughing, tearing their garments from their bodies, leaping, waving their arms, were become maniacs. "We will now release the ripe spores of giant Empusa," continued the wicked voice. "The air of the second cellar being supercharged with oxygen, they immediately germinate. Ah, it is a triumph. That process is the scientific triumph of my life." Like powdered snow, the white spores fell from the roof, frosting the writhing shapes of the already poisoned men. Before my horrified gaze, the fungus grew. It spread from the head to the feet of those it touched. It enveloped them as in glittering shrouds. "They die like flies," screamed Fu-Manchu with a sudden febrile excitement, and I felt assured of something I had long suspected, that magnificent, perverted brain was the brain of a homicidal maniac, though Smith would never accept the theory. "It is my fly trap," shrieked the Chinaman, "and I am the god of destruction." The clammy touch of the mist revived me. The culmination of the scene in the poison cellars, together with the effects of the fumes which I had inhaled again, had deprived me of consciousness. Now I knew that I was afloat on the river. I still was bound. Furthermore, a cloth was wrapped tightly about my mouth, and I was secured to a ring in the deck. By moving my aching head to the left, I could look down into the oily water. By moving it to the right, I could catch a glimpse of the empurpled face of Inspector Weymouth, who, similarly bound and gagged, lay beside me, but only of the feet and legs of Nayland Smith, for I could not turn my head sufficiently far to see more. We were aboard an electric launch. I heard the hated guttural voice of Fu-Manchu, subdued now to its habitual calm, and my heart leaped to hear the voice that answered him. It was that of Karamaneh. His triumph was complete. Clearly his plans for departure were complete. His slaughter of the police in the underground passages had been a final reckless demonstration of which the Chinaman's subtle cunning would have been incapable had he not known his escape from the country to be assured. What fate was in store for us? How would he avenge himself upon the girl who had betrayed him to his enemies? What portion awaited those enemies? He seemed to have formed the singular determination to smuggle me into China, but what did he purpose in the case of Weymouth and in the case of Nayland Smith?
All but silently we were feeling our way through the mist. Astern died the clangor of dock and wharf into a remote discord.
Ahead hung the foggy curtain veiling the traffic of the great waterway, but through it broke the calling of sirens, the tinkling of bells.
The gentle movement of the screw ceased altogether. The launch lay heaving slightly upon the swells. A distant throbbing grew louder, and something advanced upon us through the haze. A bell rang, and muffled by the fog a voice proclaimed itself, a voice which I knew. I felt Weymouth writhing impotently beside me, heard him mumbling incoherently, and I knew that he, too, had recognized the voice. It was that of Inspector Ryman of the River Police, and their launch was within biscuit throw of that upon which we lay.
"Hoy! Hoy!" I trembled.
A feverish excitement claimed me. They were hailing us. We carried no lights, but now, and ignoring the pain which shot from my spine to my skull, I craned my neck to the left. The port light of the police launch glowed angrily through the mist. I was unable to utter any save mumbling sounds, and my companions were equally helpless. It was a desperate position. Had the police seen us, or had they hailed at random? The light drew nearer.
"Launch, hoy!" They had seen us.
Fu-Manchu's guttural voice spoke shortly, and our screw began to revolve again. We leaped ahead into the bank of darkness. Faint grew the light of the police launch and was gone, but I heard Ryman's voice shouting.
"Full speed,"
came faintly through the darkness.
"Port! Port!"
Then the murk closed down, and with our friends far astern of us, we were racing deeper into the fog banks, speeding seaward, though of this I was unable to judge at the time. On we raced and on, sweeping over growing swells. Once a black towering shape dropped down upon us. Far above, lights blazed, bells rang, vague cries pierced the fog. The launch pitched and rolled perilously, but weathered the wash of the liner which so nearly had concluded this episode. It was such a journey as I had taken once before, early in our pursuit of the genius of the Yellow Peril, but this was infinitely more terrible, for now we were utterly in Fu-Manchu's power. A voice mumbled in my ear. I turned my bound-up face, and Inspector Weymouth raised his hands in the dimness and partly slipped the bandage from his mouth. "I've been working at the cord since we left those filthy cellars," he whispered. "My wrists are all cut, but when I've got out a knife and freed my ankles..." Smith had kicked him with his bound feet. The detective slipped the bandage back to position and placed his hands behind him again. Dr. Fu-Manchu, wearing a heavy overcoat but no hat, came aft. He was dragging Karamaneh by the wrists. He seated himself on the cushions near to us, pulling the girl down beside him. Now I could see her face, and the expression in her beautiful eyes made me writhe. Fu-Manchu was watching us, his discolored teeth faintly visible in the dim light, to which my eyes were becoming accustomed. "Dr. Petrie," he said, "you shall be my honored guest at my home in China. You shall assist me to revolutionize chemistry. Mr. Smith, I fear you know more of my plans than I had deemed it possible for you to have learned, and I am anxious to know if you have a confidant. Where your memory fails you, and my files and wire jackets prove ineffectual, Inspector Weymouth's recollections may prove more accurate." He turned to the cowering girl, who shrank away from him in pitiful, abject terror. "In my hands, Doctor," he continued, "I hold a needle charged with a rare culture. It is the link between the bacilli and the fungi. You have seemed to display an undue interest in the peach and pearl, which render my Karamaneh so delightful, in the supple grace of her movements and the sparkle of her eyes. You can never devote your whole mind to those studies which I have planned for you while such distractions exist. A touch of this keen point, and the laughing Karamaneh becomes the shrieking hag, the maniacal mowing. Then, with an ox-like rush, Weymouth was upon him. Karamaneh, wrought upon past endurance with a sobbing cry, sank to the deck and lay still. I managed to writhe into a half-sitting posture, and Smith rolled aside as the detective and the Chinaman crashed down together. Weymouth had one big hand at the doctor's yellow throat. With his left, he grasped the Chinaman's right. It held the needle. Now, I could look along the length of the little craft, and so far as it was possible to make out in the fog, only one other was aboard, the half-clad brown man who navigated her, and who had carried us through the cellars. The murk had grown denser and now shut us in like a box. The throb of the motor, the hissing breath of the two who fought, with so much at issue, these sounds and the wash of the water alone broke the eerie stillness. By slow degrees, and with a reptilian agility horrible to watch, Fu-Manchu was neutralizing the advantage gained by Weymouth. His clawish fingers were fast in the big man's throat.
The right hand with its deadly needle was forcing down the left of his opponent. He had been underneath, but now he was gaining the upper place. His powers of physical endurance must have been truly marvelous. His breath was whistling through his nostrils significantly, but Weymouth was palpably tiring. The latter suddenly changed his tactics. By a supreme effort, to which he was spurred, I think, by the growing proximity of the needle, he raised Fu-Manchu by the throat and arm and pitched him sideways. The Chinaman's grip did not relax, and the two wrestlers dropped, a writhing mass, upon the port cushions. The launch heeled over, and my cry of horror was crushed back into my throat by the bandage. For, as Fu-Manchu sought to extricate himself, he overbalanced, fell back, and, bearing Weymouth with him, slid into the river. The mist swallowed them up. There are moments of which no man can recall his mental impressions, moments so acutely horrible that, mercifully, our memory retains nothing of the emotions they occasioned. This was one of them. A chaos ruled in my mind. I had a vague belief that the Burman forward glanced back. Then the course of the launch was changed. How long intervened between the tragic end of that gargantuan struggle and the time when a black wall leaped suddenly up before us, I cannot pretend to state. With a sickening jerk, we ran aground. A loud explosion ensued, and I clearly remember seeing the brown man leap out into the fog, which was the last I saw of him. Water began to wash aboard. Fully alive to our imminent peril, I fought with the cords that bound me, but I lacked poor Weymouth's strength of wrist, and I began to accept as a horrible and imminent possibility a death from drowning within 6 feet of the bank. Beside me, Nayland Smith was straining and twisting. I think his object was to touch Karamaneh in the hope of arousing her. Where he failed in his project, the inflowing water succeeded. A silent prayer of thankfulness came from my very soul when I saw her stir, when I saw her raise her hands to her head, and saw the big, horror-bright eyes gleam through the mist veil. We quitted the wrecked launch but a few seconds before her stern settled down into the river. Where the mud bank upon which we found ourselves was situated, we had no idea, but at least it was terra firma, and we were free from Dr. Fu-Manchu. Smith stood looking out towards the river.
"My God," he groaned.
"My God!" He was thinking as I was of Weymouth. And when, an hour later, the police boat located us on the mud flats below Greenwich, and we heard that the toll of the poison sellers was 8 men, we also heard news of our brave companion. "Back there in the fog, sir," reported Inspector Ryman, who was in charge, and his voice was under poor command. "There was an uncanny howling and peals of laughter that I'm going to dream about for weeks." Karamaneh, who nestled beside me like a frightened child, shivered, and I knew that the needle had done its work, despite Weymouth's giant strength. Smith swallowed noisily. "Pray God the river has that yellow Satan," he said. "I would sacrifice a year of my life to see his rat's body on the end of a grappling iron." We were a sad party that steamed through the fog homeward that night. It seemed almost like deserting a staunch comrade to leave the spot, so nearly as we could locate it, where Weymouth had put up that last gallant fight. Our helplessness was pathetic, and although, had the night been clear as crystal, I doubt if we could have acted otherwise, it came to me that this stinking murk was a new enemy which drove us back in coward retreat. But so many were the calls upon our activity, and so numerous the stimulants to our initiative in those times, that soon we had matter to relieve our minds from this stress of sorrow. There was Karamaneh to be considered, Karamaneh and her brother. A brief council was held, whereat it was decided that for the present they should be lodged at a hotel. "I shall arrange," Smith whispered to me, for the girl was watching us, "to have the place patrolled night and day. You cannot suppose, Petrie, I cannot and dare not suppose Fu-Manchu dead until with my own eyes I have seen him so." Accordingly, we conveyed the beautiful Oriental girl and her brother away from that luxurious abode in its sordid setting. I will not dwell upon the final scene in the poison cellars, lest I be accused of accumulating horror for horror's sake. Members of the fire brigade, helmed against contagion, brought out the bodies of the victims wrapped in their living shrouds. From Karamaneh we learned much of Fu-Manchu, little of herself. "What am I? Does my poor history matter? To anyone?" was her answer to questions respecting herself. And she would droop her lashes over her dark eyes. The dacoits whom the Chinaman had brought to England originally numbered 7, we learned. As you, having followed me thus far, will be aware, we had thinned the ranks of the Burmans. Probably only one now remained in England. They had lived in a camp in the grounds of the house near Windsor, which, as we had learned at the time of its destruction, the doctor had bought outright.
The Thames had been his highway. Other members of the group had occupied quarters in various parts of the East End, where sailormen of all nationalities congregate. Shenyang's had been the East End headquarters. He had employed the Hulk from the time of his arrival as a laboratory for a certain class of experiments undesirable in proximity to a place of residence. Nayland Smith asked the girl on one occasion if the Chinaman had had a private seagoing vessel, and she replied in the affirmative. She had never been on board, however, had never even set eyes upon it, and could give us no information respecting its character.
It had sailed for China.
"You are sure," asked Smith keenly, "that it has actually left?" I understood so, and that we were to follow by another route. It would have been difficult for Fu-Manchu to travel by a passenger boat. I cannot say what were his plans. In a state of singular uncertainty then, readily to be understood, we passed the days following the tragedy which had deprived us of our fellow worker. Vividly I recall the scene at poor Weymouth's home on the day that we visited it. I then made the acquaintance of the inspector's brother. Nayland Smith gave him a detailed account of the last scene.
Out there in the mist, he concluded wearily. It all seemed very unreal. I wish to God it had been. Amen to that, Mr. Weymouth. But your brother made a gallant finish. If ridding the world of Fu-Manchu were the only good deed to his credit, his life had been well spent. James Weymouth smoked a while in thoughtful silence.
Though but 4.5 miles ceci of St. Paul's, the quaint little cottage, with its rustic garden, shadowed by the tall trees which had so lined the village street before motor buses were, was a spot as peaceful and secluded as any in broad England. But another shadow lay upon it today, chilling, fearful. An incarnate evil had come out of the dim east and in its dying malevolence had touched this home.
"There are two things I don't understand about it, sir," continued Weymouth.
What was the meaning of the horrible laughter which the river police heard in the fog? And where are the bodies? Karamaneh, seated beside me, shuddered at the words. Smith, whose restless spirit granted him little repose, paused in his aimless wanderings about the room and looked at her. In these latter days of his Augean labors to purge England of the unclean thing which had fastened upon her, my friend was more lean and nervous-looking than I had ever known him. His long residence in Burma had rendered him spare and had burned his naturally dark skin to a coppery hue. But now his gray eyes had grown feverishly bright, and his face so lean as at times to appear positively emaciated. But I knew that he was as fit as ever. "This lady may be able to answer your first question," he said. She and her brother were for some time in the household of Dr. Fu-Manchu. In fact, Mr. Weymouth, Karamaneh as her name implies, was a slave. Weymouth glanced at the beautiful, troubled face with scarcely veiled distrust. "You don't look as though you had come from China, miss," he said, with a sort of unwilling admiration. "I do not come from China," replied Karamaneh. "My father was a pure Badawi, but my history does not matter." At times there was something imperious in her manner, and to this her musical accent added force. "When your brave brother, Inspector Weymouth, and Dr. Fu-Manchu were swallowed up by the river, Fu-Manchu held a poisoned needle in his hand. The laughter meant that the needle had done its work. Your brother had become mad." Weymouth turned aside to hide his emotion. "What was on the needle?" he asked huskily. "It was something which he prepared from the venom of a kind of swamp adder," she answered. "It produces madness, but not always death." "He would have had a poor chance," said Smith, "even had he been in complete possession of his senses. At the time of the encounter we must have been some considerable distance from shore, and the fog was impenetrable. But how do you account for the fact that neither of the bodies have been recovered? Ryman of the river police tells me that persons lost at that point are not always recovered, or not until a considerable time later." There was a faint sound from the room above. The news of that tragic happening out in the mist upon the Thames had prostrated poor Mrs. Weymouth. "She hasn't been told half the truth," said her brother-in-law. "She doesn't know about the poison needle. What kind of fiend was this Dr. Fu-Manchu?" He burst out into a sudden blaze of furious resentment. "John never told me much, and you have let mighty little leak into the papers. What was he? Who was he?" Half he addressed the words to Smith, half to Karamaneh. "Dr. Fu-Manchu," replied the former, "was the ultimate expression of Chinese cunning, a phenomenon such as occurs but once in many generations. He was a superman of incredible genius, who, had he willed, could have revolutionized science.
There is a superstition in some parts of China according to which, under certain peculiar conditions, one of which is proximity to a deserted burial ground, an evil spirit of incredible age may enter into the body of a newborn infant. All my efforts thus far have not availed me to trace the genealogy of the man called Dr. Fu-Manchu. Even Karamaneh cannot help me in this. But I have sometimes thought that he was a member of a certain very old Kiangsu family, and that the peculiar conditions I have mentioned prevailed at his birth. Smith, observing our looks of amazement, laughed shortly and quite mirthlessly.
Poor old Weymouth, he jerked. I suppose my labors are finished, but I am far from triumphant. Is there any improvement in Mrs. Weymouth's condition?
Very little, was the reply. She has lain in a semi-conscious state since the news came. No one had any idea she would take it so. At one time we were afraid her brain was going. She seemed to have delusions. Smith spun round upon Weymouth. Of what nature? He asked rapidly. The other pulled nervously at his mustache. My wife has been staying with her, he explained, since it happened, and for the last 3 nights poor John's widow has cried out at the same time, 2:30, that someone was knocking on the door. What door? That door yonder, the street door. All our eyes turned in the direction indicated.
John often came home at 2:30 from the yard, continued Weymouth, so we naturally thought poor Mary was wandering in her mind. But last night, and it's not to be wondered at, my wife couldn't sleep, and she was wide awake at 2:30.
Well, Nayland Smith was standing before him, alert, bright-eyed. She heard it too. The sun was streaming into the cozy little sitting room, but I will confess that Weymouth's words chilled me uncannily. Karamaneh laid her hand upon mine, in a quaint childish fashion peculiarly her own. Her hand was cold, but its touch thrilled me. For Karamaneh was not a child, but a rarely beautiful girl, a pearl of the East such as many a monarch has fought for.
What then? Asked Smith.
She was afraid to move, afraid to look from the window. My friend turned and stared hard at me.
A subjective hallucination, Petrie?
In all probability, I replied. You should arrange that your wife be relieved in her trying duties, Mr. Weymouth. It is too great a strain for an inexperienced nurse. Of all that we had hoped for in our pursuit of Fu-Manchu, how little had we accomplished.
Excepting Karamaneh and her brother, who were victims and not creatures of the Chinese doctors, not one of the formidable group had fallen alive into our hands.
Dreadful crimes had marked Fu-Manchu's passage through the land. Not one half of the truth, and nothing of the later developments had been made public. Nayland Smith's authority was sufficient to control the press. In the absence of such a veto, a veritable panic must have seized upon the entire country. For a monster, a thing more than humanly evil, existed in our midst.
Always Fu-Manchu's secret activities had centered about the Great Waterway.
There was much of poetic justice in his end, for the Thames had claimed him, who so long had used the stream as a highway for the passage to and fro for his secret forces. Gone now were the yellow men who had been the instruments of his evil will. Gone was the giant intellect which had controlled the complex murder machine.
Karamaneh, whose beauty he had used as a lure, at last was free, and no more with her smile would tempt men to death, that her brother might live.
Many there are, I doubt not, who will regard the Eastern girl with horror. I ask their forgiveness in that I regarded her quite differently. No man having seen her could have condemned her unheard. Many, having looked into her lovely eyes, had they found there what I found, must have forgiven her almost any crime.
That she valued human life but little was no matter for wonder. Her nationality, her history, furnished adequate excuse for an attitude not condonable in a European equally cultured.
But indeed, let me confess that hers was a nature incomprehensible to me in some respects. The soul of Karamaneh was a closed book to my short-sighted Western eyes. But the body of Karamaneh was exquisite, her beauty of a kind that was a key to the most extravagant rhapsodies of Eastern poets. Her eyes held a challenge wholly oriental in its appeal. Her lips, even in repose, were a taunt. And herein, East is West and West is East. Finally, despite her lurid history, despite the scornful self-possession of which I knew her capable, she was an unprotected girl, in years I believe a mere child, whom fate had cast in my way. At her request, we had booked passages for her brother and herself to Egypt. The boat sailed in 3 days, but Karamaneh's beautiful eyes were sad. Often I detected tears on the black lashes.
Shall I endeavor to describe my own tumultuous, conflicting emotions? It would be useless, since I know it to be impossible. For in those dark eyes burned a fire I might not see. Those silken lashes veiled a message I dared not read. Nayland Smith was not blind to the facts of the complicated situation. I can truthfully assert that he was the only man of my acquaintance who, having come in contact with Karamaneh, had kept his head. We endeavored to divert her mind from the recent tragedies by a round of amusements. Though with poor Weymouth's body still at the mercy of unknown waters, Smith and I made but a poor show of gaiety, and I took a gloomy pride in the admiration which our lovely companion everywhere excited. I learned in those days how rare a thing in nature is a really beautiful woman. One afternoon we found ourselves at an exhibition of watercolors in Bond Street. Karamaneh was intensely interested in the subjects of the drawings, which were entirely Egyptian. As usual, she furnished matter for comment amongst the other visitors, as did the boy, Aziz, her brother, anew upon the world from his living grave in the house of Dr. Fu-Manchu. Suddenly, Aziz clutched at his sister's arm, whispering rapidly in Arabic.
I saw her peach-like color fade, saw her become pale and wild-eyed, the haunted Karamaneh of the old days. She turned to me. Dr. Petrie, he says that Fu-Manchu is here. Where? Nayland Smith rapped out the question violently, turning in a flash from the picture which he was examining. In this room, she whispered, glancing furtively, affrightedly about her. Something tells Aziz when he is near, and I too feel strangely afraid. Oh, can it be that he is not dead? She held my arm tightly. Her brother was searching the room with big velvet black eyes. I studied the faces of the several visitors, and Smith was staring about him with the old alert look and tugging nervously at the lobe of his ear. The name of the giant foe of the white race instantaneously had strung him up to a pitch of supreme intensity. Our united scrutinies discovered no figure which could have been that of the Chinese doctor. Who could mistake that long, gaunt shape with the high mummy-like shoulders and the indescribable gait, which I can only liken to that of an awkward cat? Then, over the heads of a group of people who stood by the doorway, I saw Smith peering at someone who passed across the outer room. Stepping aside, I, too, obtained a glimpse of this person. As I saw him, he was a tall, old man, wearing a black Inverness coat and a rather shabby silk hat. He had long white hair and a patriarchal beard, wore smoked glasses and walked slowly, leaning upon a stick. Smith's gaunt face paled. With a rapid glance at Karamaneh, he made off across the room. Could it be Dr. Fu-Manchu? Many days had passed since, already half choked by Inspector Weymouth's iron grip, Fu-Manchu, before our own eyes, had been swallowed up by the Thames. Even now, men were seeking his body and that of his last victim, nor had we left any stone unturned. Acting upon information furnished by Karamaneh, the police had searched every known haunt of the murder group, but everything pointed to the fact that the group was disbanded and dispersed, that the Lord of Strange Deaths who had ruled it was no more. Yet Smith was not satisfied. Neither, let me confess, was I. Every port was watched, and in suspected districts a kind of house-to-house patrol had been instituted. Unknown to the great public, in those days a secret war waged, a war in which all the available forces of the authorities took the field against one man. But that one man was the evil of the East incarnate. When we rejoined him, Nayland Smith was talking to the commissioner at the door. He turned to me. "That is Professor Genermonde," he said. "The sergeant here knows him well." The name of the celebrated Orientalist, of course, was familiar to me, although I had never before set eyes upon him. "The professor was out east the last time I was there, sir," stated the commissionaire. "I often used to see him, but he's an eccentric old gentleman. Seems to live in a world of his own. He's recently back from China, I think." Nayland Smith stood clicking his teeth together in irritable hesitation. I heard Karamaneh sigh, and, looking at her, I saw that her cheeks were regaining their natural color. She smiled in pathetic apology. "If he was here, he is gone," she said. "I am not afraid now." Smith thanked the commissionaire for his information, and we quitted the gallery. "Professor Genermonde," muttered my friend, "has lived so long in China as almost to be a Chinaman. I have never met him, never seen him before, but I wonder—" "You wonder what, Smith?" "I wonder if he could possibly be an ally of the doctor's." I stared at him in amazement. "If we are to attach any importance to the incident at all," I said, "we must remember that the boy's impression, and Karamaneh's, was that Fu-Manchu was present in person." "I do attach importance to the incident, Petrie. They are naturally sensitive to such impressions. but I doubt if even the abnormal organization of Aziz could distinguish between the hidden presence of a creature of the doctor's and that of the doctor himself. I shall make a point of calling upon Professor Jenner Monday. But fate had ordained that much should happen ere Smith made his proposed call upon the professor. Karamaneh and her brother safely lodged in their hotel, which was watched night and day by 4 men under Smith's orders. We returned to my quiet suburban rooms. "First," said Smith, "let us see what we can find out respecting Professor Monday." He went to the telephone and called up New Scotland Yard. There followed some little delay before the requisite information was obtained. Finally, however, we learned that the professor was something of a recluse, having few acquaintances and fewer friends. He lived alone in chambers in New Inn Court, Carey Street. A charwoman did such cleaning as was considered necessary by the professor, who employed no regular domestic. When he was in London, he might be seen fairly frequently at the British Museum, where his shabby figure was familiar to the officials. When he was not in London, that is, during the greater part of each year, no one knew where he went. He never left any address to which letters might be forwarded. There are moments of which no man can recall his mental impressions, moments so acutely horrible that, mercifully, our memory retains nothing of the emotions they occasioned. This was one of them. A chaos ruled in my mind. I had a vague belief that the Burman forward glanced back. Then the course of the launch was changed. How long intervened between the tragic end of that gargantuan struggle and the time when a black wall leaped suddenly up before us, I cannot pretend to state. With a sickening jerk, we ran aground. A loud explosion ensued, and I clearly remember seeing the brown man leap out into the fog, which was the last I saw of him. Water began to wash aboard. Fully alive to our imminent peril, I fought with the cords that bound me, but I lacked poor Weymouth's strength of wrist, and I began to accept as a horrible and imminent possibility a death from drowning within 6 feet of the bank. Beside me, Nayland Smith was straining and twisting. I think his object was to touch Karamaneh in the hope of arousing her. Where he failed in his project, the inflowing water succeeded. A silent prayer of thankfulness came from my very soul when I saw her stir, when I saw her raise her hands to her head, and saw the big, horror-bright eyes gleam through the mist veil. We quitted the wrecked launch but a few seconds before her stern settled down into the river. Where the mud bank upon which we found ourselves was situated, we had no idea. But at least it was terra firma, and we were free from Dr. Fu-Manchu. Smith stood looking out towards the river. "My God," he groaned. "My God!" He was thinking as I was of Weymouth. And when, an hour later, the police boat located us on the mud flats below Greenwich, and we heard that the toll of the poison sellers was 8 men, we also heard news of our brave companion. "Back there in the fog, sir," reported Inspector Ryman, who was in charge, and his voice was under poor command. "There was an uncanny howling and peals of laughter that I'm going to dream about for weeks." Karamaneh, who nestled beside me like a frightened child, shivered, and I knew that the needle had done its work, despite Weymouth's giant strength. Smith swallowed noisily. "Pray God the river has that yellow Satan," he said. "I would sacrifice a year of my life to see his rat's body on the end of a grappling iron." We were a sad party that steamed through the fog homeward that night. It seemed almost like deserting a staunch comrade to leave the spot, so nearly as we could locate it, where Weymouth had put up that last gallant fight. Our helplessness was pathetic, and although, had the night been clear as crystal, I doubt if we could have acted otherwise, it came to me that this stinking murk was a new enemy which drove us back in coward retreat. But so many were the calls upon our activity, and so numerous the stimulants to our initiative in those times, that soon we had matter to relieve our minds from this stress of sorrow. There was Karamaneh to be considered, Karamaneh and her brother. A brief council was held, whereat it was decided that for the present they should be lodged at a hotel. "I shall arrange," Smith whispered to me, for the girl was watching us, "to have the place patrolled night and day. You cannot suppose, Petrie, I cannot and dare not suppose Fu-Manchu dead until with my own eyes I have seen him so." Accordingly, we conveyed the beautiful Oriental girl and her brother away from that luxurious abode in its sordid setting. I will not dwell upon the final scene in the poison cellars, lest I be accused of accumulating horror for horror's sake. Members of the fire brigade, helmed against contagion, brought out the bodies of the victims wrapped in their living shrouds. From Karamaneh we learned much of Fu-Manchu, little of herself. What am I? Does my poor history matter? To anyone?
was her answer to questions respecting herself. And she would droop her lashes over her dark eyes. The dacoits whom the Chinaman had brought to England originally numbered 7, we learned. As you, having followed me thus far, will be aware, we had thinned the ranks of the Burmans. Probably only one now remained in England. They had lived in a camp in the grounds of the house near Windsor, which, as we had learned at the time of its destruction, the doctor had bought outright. The Thames had been his highway. Other members of the group had occupied quarters in various parts of the East End, where sailormen of all nationalities congregate. Shenyang's had been the East End headquarters. He had employed the Hulk from the time of his arrival, as a laboratory for a certain class of experiments undesirable in proximity to a place of residence. Nayland Smith asked the girl on one occasion if the Chinaman had had a private seagoing vessel, and she replied in the affirmative. She had never been on board, however, had never even set eyes upon it, and could give us no information respecting its character.
It had sailed for China.
"You are sure," asked Smith keenly, "that it has actually left?" I understood so, and that we were to follow by another route. It would have been difficult for Fu-Manchu to travel by a passenger boat. I cannot say what were his plans. In a state of singular uncertainty then, readily to be understood, we passed the days following the tragedy which had deprived us of our fellow worker. Vividly I recall the scene at poor Weymouth's home on the day that we visited it. I then made the acquaintance of the inspector's brother. Nayland Smith gave him a detailed account of the last scene.
Out there in the mist, he concluded wearily. It all seemed very unreal. I wish to God it had been. Amen to that, Mr. Weymouth. But your brother made a gallant finish. If ridding the world of Fu-Manchu were the only good deed to his credit, his life had been well spent. James Weymouth smoked a while in thoughtful silence.
Though but 4.5 miles ceci of St. Paul's, the quaint little cottage, with its rustic garden, shadowed by the tall trees which had so lined the village street before motor buses were, was a spot as peaceful and secluded as any in broad England. But another shadow lay upon it today, chilling, fearful. An incarnate evil had come out of the dim east and in its dying malevolence had touched this home. "There are 2 things I don't understand about it, sir," continued Weymouth. "What was the meaning of the horrible laughter which the river police heard in the fog? And where are the bodies?" Karamaneh, seated beside me, shuddered at the words. Smith, whose restless spirit granted him little repose, paused in his aimless wanderings about the room and looked at her. In these latter days of his Augean labors to purge England of the unclean thing which had fastened upon her, my friend was more lean and nervous-looking than I had ever known him. His long residence in Burma had rendered him spare and had burned his naturally dark skin to a coppery hue. But now his gray eyes had grown feverishly bright, and his face so lean as at times to appear positively emaciated. But I knew that he was as fit as ever. "This lady may be able to answer your first question," he said. She and her brother were for some time in the household of Dr. Fu-Manchu. In fact, Mr. Weymouth, Karamaneh as her name implies, was a slave. Weymouth glanced at the beautiful, troubled face with scarcely veiled distrust. "You don't look as though you had come from China, miss," he said, with a sort of unwilling admiration. "I do not come from China," replied Karamaneh. "My father was a pure Badawi, but my history does not matter." At times there was something imperious in her manner, and to this her musical accent added force. "When your brave brother, Inspector Weymouth, and Dr. Fu-Manchu were swallowed up by the river, Fu-Manchu held a poisoned needle in his hand. The laughter meant that the needle had done its work. Your brother had become mad." Weymouth turned aside to hide his emotion. "What was on the needle?" he asked huskily. "It was something which he prepared from the venom of a kind of swamp adder," she answered. "It produces madness, but not always death." "He would have had a poor chance," said Smith, "even had he been in complete possession of his senses. At the time of the encounter we must have been some considerable distance from shore, and the fog was impenetrable. But how do you account for the fact that neither of the bodies have been recovered? Ryman of the river police tells me that persons lost at that point are not always recovered, or not until a considerable time later." There was a faint sound from the room above. The news of that tragic happening out in the mist upon the Thames had prostrated poor Mrs. Weymouth. "She hasn't been told half the truth," said her brother-in-law. "She doesn't know about the poison needle. What kind of fiend was this Dr. Fu-Manchu?" He burst out into a sudden blaze of furious resentment. "John never told me much, and you have let mighty little leak into the papers.
What was he? Who was he? Half he addressed the words to Smith, half to Karamaneh. Dr. Fu-Manchu, replied the former, was the ultimate expression of Chinese cunning, a phenomenon such as occurs but once in many generations. He was a superman of incredible genius, who, had he willed, could have revolutionized science. There is a superstition in some parts of China according to which, under certain peculiar conditions, one of which is proximity to a deserted burial ground, an evil spirit of incredible age may enter into the body of a newborn infant. All my efforts thus far have not availed me to trace the genealogy of the man called Dr. Fu-Manchu. Even Karamaneh cannot help me in this, but I have sometimes thought that he was a member of a certain very old Kiangsu family, and that the peculiar conditions I have mentioned prevailed at his birth. Smith, observing our looks of amazement, laughed shortly and quite mirthlessly. Poor old Weymouth, he jerked. I suppose my labors are finished, but I am far from triumphant. Is there any improvement in Mrs. Weymouth's condition? Very little, was the reply. She has lain in a semi-conscious state since the news came. No one had any idea she would take it so. At one time we were afraid her brain was going. She seemed to have delusions. Smith spun round upon Weymouth. Of what nature? He asked rapidly. The other pulled nervously at his mustache. My wife has been staying with her, he explained, since it happened, and for the last 3 nights poor John's widow has cried out at the same time, 2:30, that someone was knocking on the door. What door? That door yonder, the street door. All our eyes turned in the direction indicated. John often came home at 2:30 from the yard, continued Weymouth, so we naturally thought poor Mary was wandering in her mind. But last night, and it's not to be wondered at, my wife couldn't sleep, and she was wide awake at 2:30. Well, Nayland Smith was standing before him, alert, bright-eyed. She heard it too. The sun was streaming into the cozy little sitting room, but I will confess that Weymouth's words chilled me uncannily. Karamaneh laid her hand upon mine, in a quaint childish fashion peculiarly her own. Her hand was cold, but its touch thrilled me. For Karamaneh was not a child, but a rarely beautiful girl, a pearl of the East such as many a monarch has fought for. What then? Asked Smith. She was afraid to move, afraid to look from the window. My friend turned and stared hard at me. A subjective hallucination, Petrie? In all probability, I replied. You should arrange that your wife be relieved in her trying duties, Mr. Weymouth. It is too great a strain for an inexperienced nurse. Of all that we had hoped for in our pursuit of Fu-Manchu, how little had we accomplished. Excepting Karamaneh and her brother, who were victims and not creatures of the Chinese doctors, not one of the formidable group had fallen alive into our hands. Dreadful crimes had marked Fu-Manchu's passage through the land. Not one half of the truth, and nothing of the later developments had been made public. Nayland Smith's authority was sufficient to control the press. In the absence of such a veto, a veritable panic must have seized upon the entire country, for a monster, a thing more than humanly evil, existed in our midst. Always Fu-Manchu's secret activities had centered about the Great Waterway. There was much of poetic justice in his end, for the Thames had claimed him, who so long had used the stream as a highway for the passage to and fro for his secret forces. Gone now were the yellow men who had been the instruments of his evil will. Gone was the giant intellect which had controlled the complex murder machine. Karamaneh, whose beauty he had used as a lure, at last was free, and no more with her smile would tempt men to death, that her brother might live. Many there are, I doubt not, who will regard the Eastern girl with horror. I ask their forgiveness in that I regarded her quite differently. No man having seen her could have condemned her unheard. Many, having looked into her lovely eyes, had they found there what I found, must have forgiven her almost any crime. That she valued human life but little was no matter for wonder. Her nationality, her history, furnished adequate excuse for an attitude not condonable in a European equally cultured. But indeed, let me confess that hers was a nature incomprehensible to me in some respects. The soul of Karamaneh was a closed book to my short-sighted Western eyes. But the body of Karamaneh was exquisite, her beauty of a kind that was a key to the most extravagant rhapsodies of Eastern poets. Her eyes held a challenge wholly oriental in its appeal. Her lips, even in repose, were a taunt. And herein, East is West and West is East. Finally, despite her lurid history,
Despite the scornful self-possession of which I knew her capable, she was an unprotected girl, in years I believe a mere child, whom fate had cast in my way. At her request, we had booked passages for her brother and herself to Egypt. The boat sailed in 3 days, but Karamaneh's beautiful eyes were sad. Often I detected tears on the black lashes. Shall I endeavor to describe my own tumultuous, conflicting emotions? It would be useless, since I know it to be impossible. For in those dark eyes burned a fire I might not see. Those silken lashes veiled a message I dared not read. Nayland Smith was not blind to the facts of the complicated situation. I can truthfully assert that he was the only man of my acquaintance who, having come in contact with Karamaneh, had kept his head. We endeavored to divert her mind from the recent tragedies by a round of amusements. Though with poor Weymouth's body still at the mercy of unknown waters, Smith and I made but a poor show of gaiety, and I took a gloomy pride in the admiration which our lovely companion everywhere excited. I learned in those days how rare a thing in nature is a really beautiful woman. One afternoon we found ourselves at an exhibition of watercolors in Bond Street. Karamaneh was intensely interested in the subjects of the drawings, which were entirely Egyptian. As usual, she furnished matter for comment amongst the other visitors, as did the boy, Aziz, her brother, anew upon the world from his living grave in the house of Dr. Fu-Manchu. Suddenly, Aziz clutched at his sister's arm, whispering rapidly in Arabic. I saw her peach-like color fade, saw her become pale and wild-eyed, the haunted Karamaneh of the old days. She turned to me. Dr. Petrie, he says that Fu-Manchu is here. Where? Nayland Smith rapped out the question violently, turning in a flash from the picture which he was examining. In this room, she whispered, glancing furtively, affrightedly about her. Something tells Aziz when he is near, and I too feel strangely afraid. Oh, can it be that he is not dead? She held my arm tightly. Her brother was searching the room with big velvet black eyes. I studied the faces of the several visitors, and Smith was staring about him with the old alert look and tugging nervously at the lobe of his ear. The name of the giant foe of the white race instantaneously had strung him up to a pitch of supreme intensity. Our united scrutinies discovered no figure which could have been that of the Chinese doctor. Who could mistake that long, gaunt shape with the high mummy-like shoulders and the indescribable gait, which I can only liken to that of an awkward cat? Then, over the heads of a group of people who stood by the doorway, I saw Smith peering at someone who passed across the outer room. Stepping aside, I, too, obtained a glimpse of this person. As I saw him, he was a tall, old man, wearing a black Inverness coat and a rather shabby silk hat. He had long white hair and a patriarchal beard, wore smoked glasses and walked slowly, leaning upon a stick. Smith's gaunt face paled. With a rapid glance at Karamaneh, he made off across the room. Could it be Dr. Fu-Manchu? Many days had passed since, already half choked by Inspector Weymouth's iron grip, Fu-Manchu, before our own eyes, had been swallowed up by the Thames. Even now, men were seeking his body and that of his last victim, nor had we left any stone unturned. Acting upon information furnished by Karamaneh, the police had searched every known haunt of the murder group, but everything pointed to the fact that the group was disbanded and dispersed, that the Lord of Strange Deaths who had ruled it was no more. Yet Smith was not satisfied. Neither, let me confess, was I. Every port was watched, and in suspected districts a kind of house-to-house patrol had been instituted. Unknown to the great public, in those days a secret war waged, a war in which all the available forces of the authorities took the field against one man. But that one man was the evil of the East incarnate. When we rejoined him, Nayland Smith was talking to the commissionaire at the door. He turned to me. "That is Professor Genermonde," he said. "The sergeant here knows him well." The name of the celebrated Orientalist, of course, was familiar to me, although I had never before set eyes upon him. "The professor was out east the last time I was there, sir," stated the commissionaire. "I often used to see him, but he's an eccentric old gentleman. Seems to live in a world of his own. He's recently back from China, I think." Nayland Smith stood clicking his teeth together in irritable hesitation. I heard Karamaneh sigh, and, looking at her, I saw that her cheeks were regaining their natural color. She smiled in pathetic apology. "If he was here, he is gone," she said. "I am not afraid now." Smith thanked the commissionaire for his information, and we quitted the gallery. "Professor Genermonde," muttered my friend, "has lived so long in China as almost to be a Chinaman. I have never met him, never seen him before, but I wonder—" "You wonder what, Smith?"
I wonder if he could possibly be an ally of the doctor's. I stared at him in amazement. If we are to attach any importance to the incident at all, I said, we must remember that the boy's impression, and Karamaneh's, was that Fu-Manchu was present in person. I do attach importance to the incident, Petrie. They are naturally sensitive to such impressions. But I doubt if even the abnormal organization of Aziz could distinguish between the hidden presence of a creature of the doctor's and that of the doctor himself. I shall make a point of calling upon Professor Jenner Monday. But fate had ordained that much should happen ere Smith made his proposed call upon the professor. Karamaneh and her brother safely lodged in their hotel, which was watched night and day by 4 men under Smith's orders. We returned to my quiet suburban rooms. First, said Smith, let us see what we can find out respecting Professor Monday. He went to the telephone and called up New Scotland Yard. There followed some little delay before the requisite information was obtained. Finally, however, we learned that the professor was something of a recluse, having few acquaintances and fewer friends. He lived alone in chambers in New Inn Court, Carey Street. A charwoman did such cleaning as was considered necessary by the professor, who employed no regular domestic. When he was in London, he might be seen fairly frequently at the British Museum, where his shabby figure was familiar to the officials. When he was not in London, that is, during the greater part of each year, no one knew where he went. He never left any address to which letters might be forwarded. I knew that to mean that a messenger had come, but from whence or bearing what tidings I knew not. My friend's plans were incomprehensible to me, nor had I pressed him for any explanation of their nature, knowing him to be in that high-strung and somewhat irritable mood which claimed him at times of uncertainty, when he doubted the wisdom of his actions, the accuracy of his surmises. He gave no sign. Very faintly I heard a clock strike the half-hour. A soft breeze stole again through the branches above. The wind, I thought, must be in a new quarter since I had not heard the clock before. In so lonely a spot, it was difficult to believe that the bell was that of St. Paul's. Yet such was the fact. And hard upon the ringing followed another sound. A sound we all had expected, had waited for. But at whose coming no one of us, I think, retained complete mastery of himself. Breaking up the silence in a manner that set my heart wildly leaping, it came. An imperative knocking on the door. "My God," groaned Weymouth. But he did not move from his position at the window. "Stand by, Petrie," said Smith. He strode to the door and threw it widely open. I know I was very pale. I think I cried out as I fell back, retreated with clenched hands from before that which stood on the threshold. It was a wild, unkempt figure with straggling beard, hideously staring eyes. With its hands it clutched at its hair, at its chin, plucked at its mouth. No moonlight touched the features of this unearthly visitant, but scanty as was the illumination, we could see the gleaming teeth and the wildly glaring eyes. It began to laugh, peal after peal, hideous and shrill. Nothing so terrifying had ever smote upon my ears. I was palsied by the horror of the sound. Then Nayland Smith pressed the button of an electric torch which he carried. He directed the disk of white light fully upon the face in the doorway. "Oh God," cried Weymouth. "It's John." And again, "Oh God, oh God." Perhaps for the first time in my life I really believed, nay, I could not doubt, that a thing of another world stood before me. I am ashamed to confess the extent of the horror that came upon me. James Weymouth raised his hands, as if to thrust away from him that awful thing in the door. He was babbling, prayers I think, but wholly incoherent. "Hold him, Petrie!" Smith's voice was low. When we were past thought or intelligent action, he, dominant and cool, with that forced calm for which, a crisis over, he always paid so dearly, was thinking of the woman who slept above. He leaped forward, and in the instant that he grappled with the one who had knocked, I knew the visitant for a man of flesh and blood, a man who shrieked and fought like a savage animal, foamed at the mouth and gnashed his teeth in horrid frenzy. Knew him for a madman, knew him for the victim of Fu-Manchu, not dead but living, for Inspector Weymouth, a maniac. In a flash I realized all this and sprang to Smith's assistance. There was a sound of racing footsteps, and the men who had been watching outside came running into the porch. A third was with them, and the 5 of us, for Weymouth's brother had not yet grasped the fact that a man and not a spirit shrieked and howled in our midst, clung to the infuriated madman, yet barely held our own with him. "The syringe, Petrie!" gasped Smith. "Quick! You must manage to make an injection!" I extricated myself and raced into the cottage for my bag.
a hypodermic syringe ready charged I had brought with me at Smith's request. Even in that thrilling moment, I could find time to admire the wonderful foresight of my friend, who had divined what would befall, isolated the strange, pitiful truth from the chaotic circumstances which saw us at Maple Cottage that night. Let me not enlarge upon the end of the awful struggle. At one time I despaired, we all despaired, of quieting the poor, demented creature. But at last it was done, and the gaunt, blood-stained savage whom we had known as Detective Inspector Weymouth lay passive upon the couch in his own sitting room. A great wonder possessed my mind for the genius of the uncanny being who with the scratch of a needle had made a brave and kindly man into this unclean, brutish thing. Nayland Smith, gaunt and wild-eyed, and trembling yet with his tremendous exertions, turned to the man whom I knew to be the messenger from Scotland Yard.
"Well," he rapped. "He is arrested, sir," the detective reported.
"They have kept him at his chambers, as you ordered."
"Has she slept through it?"
said Smith to me. I had just returned from a visit to the room above. I nodded. "Is he safe for an hour or two?" indicating the figure on the couch.
"For 8 or 10, I replied grimly.
"Come then. Our night's labors are not nearly complete." Later was forthcoming evidence to show that poor Weymouth had lived a wild life, in hiding among the thick bushes of the tract of land which lay between the village and the suburb on the neighboring hill. Literally, he had returned to primitive savagery, and some of his food had been that of the lower animals, though he had not scrupled to steal, as we learned when his lair was discovered. He had hidden himself cunningly, but witnesses appeared who had seen him in the dusk and fled from him. They never learned that the object of their fear was Inspector John Weymouth. How, having escaped death in the Thames, he had crossed London unobserved, we never knew, but his trick of knocking upon his own door at 2:30 each morning, a sort of dawning of sanity mysteriously linked with old custom, will be a familiar class of symptom to all students of alienation. I revert to the night when Smith solved the mystery of the knocking. In a car which he had in waiting at the end of the village, we sped through the deserted streets to New Inn Court. I, who had followed Nayland Smith through the failures and successes of his mission, knew that tonight he had surpassed himself, had justified the confidence placed in him by the highest authorities. We were admitted to an untidy room, that of a student, a traveler, and a crank, by a plainclothes officer. Amid picturesque and disordered fragments of 100 ages, in a great carven chair placed before a towering statue of the Buddha, sat a handcuffed man. His white hair and beard were patriarchal. His pose had great dignity, but his expression was entirely masked by the smoked glasses which he wore. 2 other detectives were guarding the prisoner. "We arrested Professor Jenner Monday as he came in, sir," reported the man who had opened the door. "He has made no statement. I hope there isn't a mistake." "I hope not," rapped Smith. He strode across the room. He was consumed by a fever of excitement. Almost savagely, he tore away the beard, tore off the snowy wig, dashed the smoked glasses upon the floor. A great high brow was revealed, and green, malignant eyes, which fixed themselves upon him with an expression I never can forget. "It was Dr. Fu-Manchu!" One intense moment of silence ensued, of silence which seemed to throb. Then, "What have you done with Professor Monday?" demanded Smith. Dr. Fu-Manchu showed his even yellow teeth in the singularly evil smile which I knew so well. A manacled prisoner, he sat as unruffled as a judge upon the bench. In truth and in justice, I am compelled to say that Fu-Manchu was absolutely fearless. "He has been detained in China," he replied, in smooth, sibilant tones, "by affairs of great urgency. His well-known personality and ungregarious habits have served me well here." Smith, I could see, was undetermined how to act. He stood tugging at his ear and glancing from the impassive Chinaman to the wondering detectives. "What are we to do, sir?" one of them asked. "Leave Dr. Petrie and myself alone with the prisoner, until I call you." The 3 withdrew. I divined now what was coming. "Can you restore Weymouth's sanity?" rapped Smith abruptly. "I cannot save you from the hangman, nor—" His fists clenched convulsively. "Would I if I could, but—" Fu-Manchu fixed his brilliant eyes upon him. "Say no more, Mr. Smith," he interrupted. "You misunderstand me. I do not quarrel with that, but what I have done from conviction and what I have done of necessity are separated, are seas apart. The brave Inspector Weymouth I wounded with a poisoned needle, in self-defense, but I regret his condition as greatly as you do. I respect such a man. There is an antidote to the poison of the needle." "Name it," said Smith. Fu-Manchu smiled again.
Useless, he replied.
I alone can prepare it. My secrets shall die with me. I will make a sane man of Inspector Weymouth, but no one else shall be in the house but he and I. It will be surrounded by police, interrupted Smith grimly.
As you please, said Fu-Manchu. Make your arrangements. In that ebony case upon the table are the instruments for the cure. Arrange for me to visit him where and when you will. I distrust you utterly. It is some trick, jerked Smith.
Dr. Fu-Manchu rose slowly and drew himself up to his great height. His manacled hands could not rob him of the uncanny dignity which was his. He raised them above his head with a tragic gesture and fixed his piercing gaze upon Nayland Smith.
The god of Cathay hear me, he said, with a deep, guttural note in his voice. I swear, the most awful visitor who ever threatened the peace of England. The end of the visit of Fu-Manchu was characteristic, terrible, inexplicable.
Strange to relate, I did not doubt that this weird being had conceived some kind of admiration or respect for the man to whom he had wrought so terrible an injury.
He was capable of such sentiments, for he entertained some similar one in regard to myself.
A cottage farther down the village street than Weymouth's was vacant, and in the early dawn of that morning became the scene of outre happenings.
Poor Weymouth, still in a comatose condition, we removed there, Smith having secured the key from the astonished agent. I suppose so strange a specialist never visited a patient before, certainly not under such conditions.
For into the cottage, which had been entirely surrounded by a ring of police, Dr. Fu-Manchu was admitted from the closed car in which, his work of healing complete, he was to be borne to prison, to death. Law and justice were suspended by my royally empowered friend, that the enemy of the white race might heal one of those who had hunted him down. No curious audience was present, for sunrise was not yet come. No concourse of excited students followed the hand of the master. But within that surrounded cottage was performed one of those miracles of science which in other circumstances had made the fame of Dr. Fu-Manchu to live forever.
Inspector Weymouth, dazed, disheveled, clutching his head as a man who has passed through the valley of the shadow, but sane,
walked out into the porch.
He looked towards us, his eyes wild, but not with the fearsome wildness of insanity.
Mr. Smith,
he cried, and staggered down the path. Dr. Petrie, what? There came a deafening explosion. From every visible window of the deserted cottage, flames burst forth.
Quick! Smith's voice rose almost to a scream. Into the house!
He raced up the path, past Inspector Weymouth, who stood swaying there like a drunken man. I was close upon his heels.
Behind me came the police. The door was impassable. Already it vomited a deathly heat, borne upon stifling fumes like those of the mouth of the pit. We burst a window. The room within was a furnace.
My God, cried someone.
This is supernatural. Listen, cried another.
Listen.
The crowd which a fire can conjure up at any hour of day or night, out of the void of nowhere, was gathering already. But upon all descended a pall of silence. From the heat of the Holocaust, a voice proclaimed itself. A voice raised, not in anguish, but in triumph. It chanted barbarically and was still. The abnormal flames rose higher, leaping forth from every window.
The alarm, said Smith hoarsely. Call up the brigade.
I come to the close of my chronicle and feel that I betray a trust, the trust of my reader. For having limned in the colors at my command the fiendish Chinese doctor, I am unable to conclude my task as I should desire, unable with any consciousness of finality to write finis to the end of my narrative. It seems to me sometimes that my pen is but temporarily idle, that I have but dealt with a single phase of a movement having 100 phases. One sequel I hope for, and against all the promptings of logic and Western bias. If my hope shall be realized, I cannot at this time pretend to state. The future, mid its many secrets, holds this precious one from me. I ask you then to absolve me from the charge of ill completing my work, for any curiosity with which this narrative may leave the reader burdened is shared by the writer. With intent, I have rushed you from the chambers of Professor Jenner Monde to that closing episode at the deserted cottage. I have made the pace hot in order to impart to these last pages of my account something of the breathless scurry which characterized those happenings. My canvas may seem sketchy, it is my impression of the reality. No hard details remain in my mind of the dealings of that night. Fu-Manchu arrested, Fu-Manchu manacled entering the cottage on his mission of healing, Weymouth miraculously rendered sane coming forth, the place in flames. And then, to a shell the cottage burned,
with an incredible rapidity which pointed to some hidden agency, to a shell about ashes which held no trace of human bones. It has been asked of me, was there no possibility of Fu-Manchus having eluded us in the ensuing confusion? Was there no loophole of escape? I reply that so far as I was able to judge, a rat could scarce have quitted the building undetected. Yet that Fu-Manchu had, in some incomprehensible manner and by some mysterious agency, produced those abnormal flames, I cannot doubt. Did he voluntarily ignite his own funeral pyre? As I write, there lies before me a soiled and creased sheet of vellum. It bears some lines traced in a cramped, peculiar, and all but illegible hand. This fragment was found by Inspector Weymouth, to this day a man mentally sound, in a pocket of his ragged garments. When it was written, I leave you to judge. How it came to be where Weymouth found it calls for no explanation. To Mr. Commissioner Nayland Smith and Dr. Petrie, greeting. I am recalled home by one who may not be denied. In much that I came to do, I have failed. Much that I have done I would undo, some little I have undone. Out of fire I came, the smoldering fire of a thing one day to be a consuming flame. In fire I go, seek not my ashes. I am the Lord of the Fires. Farewell. Fu-Manchu. Who has been with me in my several meetings with the man who penned that message, I leave to a judge if it be the letter of a madman bent upon self-destruction by strange means, or the jibe of a preternaturally clever scientist and the most elusive being ever born of the land of mystery, China. For the present, I can aid you no more in the forming of your verdict. A day may come, though I pray it do not, when I shall be able to throw new light upon much that is dark in this matter. That day, so far as I can judge, could only dawn in the event of the Chinaman's survival. Therefore I pray that the veil be never lifted. But, as I have said, there is another sequel to this story which I can contemplate with a different countenance. How then shall I conclude this very unsatisfactory account? Shall I tell you finally of my parting with lovely dark-eyed Karamaneh on board the liner which was to bear her to Egypt? No, let me instead conclude with the words of Nayland Smith. I sail for Burma in a fortnight, Petrie. I have leave to break my journey at the ditch. How would a run up the Nile fit your program? Bit early for the season, but you might find something to amuse you. End of the project. Gutenberg ebook, The Insidious Dr. Fu-Manchu. Updated editions will replace the previous one. The old editions will be renamed. Creating the works from print editions not protected by U.S. copyright law means that no one owns a United States copyright in these works, so the Foundation, and you, can copy and distribute it in the United States without permission and without paying copyright royalties. Special rules, set forth in the general terms of use part of this license, apply to copying and distributing Project Gutenberg (TM) electronic works to protect the Project Gutenberg TEM concept and trademark. And Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark and may not be used if you charge for an ebook, except by following the terms of the trademark license, including paying royalties for use of the Project Gutenberg trademark. If you do not charge anything for copies of this ebook, complying with the trademark license is very easy. You may use this ebook for nearly any purpose, such as creation of derivative works, reports, performances, and research. Project Gutenberg ebooks may be modified and printed and given away. You may do practically anything in the United States with ebooks not protected by U.S. copyright law. Redistribution is subject to the trademark license, especially commercial redistribution.